I want to go back. For you as a pollster, you as a statistician, you as a big data guy, make the argument right now of why CNN called this too early, giving all the uncertainty about the verification of this vote, all the from Georgia to Arizona to Nevada to all parts of Pennsylvania. What's the argument against calling this vote as they just called it?
Well, this is not the first election where we have anomalies and we have contests. So Al Gore took 31 days over one county in a single state. They gave him the benefit of the doubt with that. Now, that was a smaller number of votes, no doubt. But it's a different issue. We're talking about legal challenges that could have an impact on large numbers of votes. Biden's
hang on one second. I just want to make sure to put it in perspective. They called it for Bush, and Gore conceded. He took that concession back, which remember, concessions have no legal standing. Calling it has no legal standing. This is the point people have to understand. Even in that fiasco, it was called for Bush. Gore conceded. Then some certain networks took it off. Others kept it on, but it still had a legal process. You still had a process. That process got fully adjudicated in Florida. Finally, the Supreme Court stepped in, and it made the Electoral College on the 14th of December, 31 days. We got plenty of time here until the tripwires of 6 December and the safe harbor of 8 December. We got plenty of time, and the president gets – this is why there's a gap between when the vote is taken and when the vote has to be certified, according to the rules laid out in the Constitution. So you think right now that there's enough, here in Georgia – where we were supposed to wrap up last night, they still got votes coming in. They're still popping up. They got provisional ballots. They got military ballots. All of this. In all of this confusion, particularly when you're talking literally a couple thousand votes on either side, and how many weird statistical patterns exist, right, in these numbers, and how you have African Americans saying, hey, we're not going to be the face of the con here, right? There's something suspicious about the percentage numbers for Joe Biden. Joe Biden is not Barack Obama. Right, Joe Biden is not, quite frankly, a legendary, charismatic, a guy who would be historic. Right, he's not. He's a cipher wandering around a car dealership up in Wilmington, Delaware. And last night, the thing was embarrassing. He also talked about radical change. He understands what's coming: climate change, the structure of our vote, all of it. It's radical change coming for an illegitimate president, an illegitimate presidency. So, if that's what you want, then you buy into the CNN narrative. If that's not what you want, you got buying iron. Okay, Richard, we're going to come back. We want to talk about Nevada. We want to talk about some of the other states that are out there, and also get back your thoughts on CNN and the media apparatus calling this now and trying to basically use information warfare to crush the president and his movement and to steal this election. Maggie Vanderberg, Jack Maxey, Stephen K. Bannon, Richard Barris from Big Data Polling. We're going to return in just a second. 2 hours here today, americasvoice.news. Go there, that website right now. The streaming service is up. It's on.
Okay, so we'll keep an eye on what Steve Bannon has to say. Meanwhile, here is Michelle Malkin.
Now, it's election chaos 2020. You knew it was coming. After months of engineered chaos on the streets, engineered chaos came to America's polling places. Hundreds of thousands of ballots turned up seemingly out of thin air. Poll workers in battleground states clocked out just hours after the polls closed and then announced that they wouldn't start counting ballots until a day or 2 or 3 or 9 days after Election Day. Shockingly, in the nation's most hotly contested districts, Republican poll watchers were blocked from exercising their legally protected rights to observe ballot counts. This was the crazy scene in Wayne County, Michigan, where GOP observers got locked out of a voting center on Wednesday. Michigan poll workers even taped pizza boxes to windows to obstruct poll observers' views.
I didn't know if you could blow it up because it's not big enough. Stop it in the door now. Pizza boxes to cover this room as we speak right now.
GOP poll worker and activist Matt Seeley was there, and he described to me what happened when he and several hundred observers and challengers showed up to do their jobs.
All of a sudden, they locked the doors and said, we're at capacity. No one else is coming in. And then they announced, if you guys want to go get lunch, go get lunch. So a lot of our workers left to go get refreshment in this ballroom that they provided us with, thinking that when we left the room, they'd let another Republican in to take our place, right? Mm-hmm. Not only did they not let them in, they didn't let the person who went to lunch back in. Meanwhile, the Democrats inside the counting room were provided with an area where they could have bottled water, coffee, donuts. They brought in Jimmy John's box lunches, so they never had to leave the room. So they knew in advance they were going to lock us out.
And here was the scene on Thursday outside the convention center in Detroit, where GOP observers were locked out as Democrats conducted their secretive count away from prying eyes. As I warned you weeks ago, anti-Trump forces have used COVID as a grand ruse to hijack the election process. Big League Politics reporter Shane Trejo obtained an audio recording of a Detroit poll worker training session where participants cackled at using social distancing to obstruct challengers' views.
That's important because they can come behind your table. But if you don't have 6 feet, they can't come back there. They cannot wear anything that signifies who they work for. It has to be on their card. So they can't walk in with a party or anything on, just like you can on your mask, they can't either. Any questions?
So for 6 feet back, once they have really good vision, they can actually see.
Exactly. Yes, they got really good vision, or they brought their binoculars. 6 feet. That's the rule, right?
Okay, let's go back here to Steve Bannon, America's Voice.
Also, other places would go there. They've fought off a DDoS attack today to get us up. Really appreciate the guys in Denver doing that. We're in the War Room, Nation's Capital, live at Saturday, the 7th of November, 2020. Just a programming note, since we lost the ability to get up for the first hour at 10 o'clock. We started at 11, and we're going to stay through. 1 p.m. So it's 11 to 1 today. We've got a lot of breaking news. We've got Richard Barris up here. CNN has called it for Biden. And obviously, it's been a lot of other networks have pounded in here, and so that has no legal standing. Remember, Rudy Giuliani, and it's interesting. They wanted to get in front of the president's announced lawsuit. That's why as soon as they knew this thing was scheduled at 11 o'clock, they dropped it right on top of what Rudy's talking about, and the good news we had it coming out of Maricopa County. So once again, Rich, I want to go back to you. Why is it, given all this chaos, there's all these ballots still coming in, there's all this discrepancy, not just of poll workers and software programs in Michigan and all this, but there's these major statistical discrepancies about these single vote Biden ballots, right? In addition, you've got provisional ballots. It's not no order and discipline right now in this, and you should be taking your time and going through this and making sure it's every vote, every certifiable, verifiable ballot that must be counted. The ones that are not certifiable are not verifiable. That don't have chain of custody cannot be counted. We know they did this as part of information warfare to try to break the spirits of the Trump movement, the people that voted for Trump. Walk through the statistical reasons why you say it's too early to call this, given everything that's out there.
Right. So they would never do this in any other case. And it's important to remember that this was a change. We hit our electoral system with such a massive change that it really wasn't designed for this. So we should have expected these kinds of anomalies and these kinds of differences. You look in Georgia, for instance, there are only two reasons for undervotes like that. One could be ballot design. The other one could be a red flag. But, without even getting into that, I mean, Steve, the bottom line is these court cases could impact huge numbers of votes. I don't know if you guys are showing the screen, but in Pennsylvania alone, we're talking about 34,000 votes. That's it. That is 1/3 of one contested issue. That's all. So if that would have that one challenge would have the implication of changing the result of the election. So there is no credible reason not to let the process play out. There's just not. And that takes provisionals off the table. I'm not even addressing that. So that's a whole nother element. They're really, in my mind, it's about as credible as calling Arizona on election night without the rest of the vote being counted. And now look at where we are 5 days later, almost, with Arizona. It's a coin flip. So we have a process. There's a reason why you take your time to sort it out. The media isn't a legal authority. They're supposed to wait and be responsible, and they're not doing this. They're not doing this correctly.
Let's go back. Let's go to Georgia real quickly. We got a couple of minutes left. I know you got to bounce at noon. Let's go to Georgia. What is happening there? Because this is now going off the skids, even from last night when we left the show yesterday afternoon.
Yeah, we were talking about 2,000 votes in Georgia. There is a lot of concern, too, now in Georgia that they had the same software issues that we saw in Michigan, which is something that hasn't been ironed out yet. One county out of 47 has been ironed out. That's it. Now there's concern over that. But the ballots were 2,000. That would not have been enough for Joe Biden to overcome what was likely an overwhelming absentee ballot vote from military ballots, or at least it would have put it in recount territory. And now there was another 5,000 that came in. So we always expect ballots to trickle in, but it's getting a little out of hand.
When did the Secretary of State given any heads up on when they're going to actually wrap up Georgia?
That was supposed to be today. But I'm not sure now. Because that'll be a recount and a recanvass. What about Arizona? If we continue to trend, we're now down around 20. We still got over 100,000, almost 200,000 out. We don't even know if that counts provisionals. What I know, Arizona has a very tight law. I think it's like 500 votes or something for a recount, but
1/10 of 1%.
1/10 of 1%.
There's multiple reasons that could trigger it. It's 1/10 of 1%, or depending on how many total votes cast, if there's a certain number of votes that's separated. So there are multiple ways this could end in a recount. It depends really it really does depend on how this next dump in Maricopa breaks. Wouldn't be surprised if it is 1/10.
We got about 2 minutes left. I just want to do Nevada real quickly. What about Nevada before you go?
Nevada, Washoe, what we got out of Washoe was actually not that bad. It was just a couple thousand votes so far. It wasn't that bad for the president, but really he needed it to tighten, not widen. What's doing it is Clark. There's some more stuff just trickling in from Clark County. That's what's widening out Biden's margin. We've seen nothing still from Douglas.
But it's more than trickling in. I mean, Clark County had reported they were done a couple of days ago, and you just see Clark County continue to come up with ballots. I mean, this is the thing that's frustrating, and this is why you've got to get lawsuits. There's already 3,200 ballots for criminal referral to the Justice Department about being people that don't live in the state anymore, and that Grinnell tells me that's just the start, right? They think they've got 10,000 or more.
I was just going to say that actually we heard it's a lot, Steve. It was 6, then it was 10. I mean, there are real problems in this election, folks. There are a lot of serious irregularities and disparities, and it needs to play out.
I don't know if this number is good, but New York Times is reporting that only 6% of Nevada counties have actually reported their absentee votes, and they said that the ones that they have reported broke 88% to 9% for Trump. So that's probably going to be another issue as well.
Well, they mean 6% is in the total number of counties. That makes sense to me, actually, because we have all this.
Only one of 17 counties has reported them.
So, Richard, thank you very much. How do people what's your Twitter handle, and how do people get to your website?
Sure, they can follow the results at peoplespunditdaily.com, and they can follow me on Twitter.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on what Steve Bannon has to say. Here's Michelle Malkin.
You are entitled to your 6 feet.
This is all part of the plan. He who harvests the ballots controls the ballots. He who counts the votes controls the votes. This is not conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy truth. Look at Pennsylvania. After winning a ruling from a federal judge to get access to the ballot counting process, GOP poll workers in the Keystone State were still locked out. Can you believe this photo? It looks more reminiscent of a banana republic than our once proud and functional constitutional republic. Trump campaign surrogate Corey Lewandowski condemned the obstruction.
They have 8 attorneys fighting us to see these ballots inside. The court order is in effect. They will not give us access, and the sheriff has decided not to come down here to enforce that court order. The sheriff of your county will not come down and enforce a court order. What is going on in this city? What are you hiding? Open up the doors, let us in, let us 6 feet away so that we can have a free and fair election.
Here's the thing. The FBI and the GOP both have known for years what the left's election thieves have been up to. Independent citizen journalists and watchdogs like Megan Barth in Battleground, Nevada, have collected evidence of dirty voter rolls for years, and nobody did nothing.
And so I've been reporting on voter fraud for 5 years. We had a whistleblower from the post office come forward in 2016 saying that ballots went missing. We handed all of our evidence, including 3,000 envelopes, over to the FBI. These envelopes represented returned campaign mailers from supposedly actively registered voters. We turned all of this evidence over to the FBI, the local FBI office, and they never opened the case.
It's going to take all hands on deck to stop this long-planned steal. It demands the very kind of coordinated and concerted citizen activism that the establishment GOP has long neglected. Look, many Beltway Republicans are AWOL. Where are they? But the rest of us who are fighting to preserve a sovereign nation for our children and grandchildren have no choice but to raise hell and raise our voices.
Stop the steal! 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 Stop the steal!
The Biden crime family stealing the election! The media's covering up! The Biden crime family stealing this election! The media's covering it up!
If we don't speak up now, it's people like this homicidal maniac and his mob pals who are going to run this country.
Right now, I'm gonna blow his brains out. I'll kill him. Trump is a racist.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get news.
Things I've never even heard of. So bully for you guys. We've getting the word out.
Last night we got Hindu distribution. We got distribution all over the world. People, listen, here's the reason they're after us. This show is metastasizing. This show's got the best guests, best analytics. 8 hours the other night, ladies and gentlemen. I got so many comments. Hedge fund people, political operators throughout the world, guys around Washington, D.C. 8 hours of no happy talk. I mean, hardcore analytics, hardcore legal analysis. Very proud of that. No goofing around. 8 hours of just pure
also,
fire.
Steve, I think it's really important that we remember that so many people from around the world, many people in South Africa have been calling us, people in Brazil have been reaching out to me because they realize if Donald Trump doesn't win, they've lost South Africa to the Chinese Communist Party.
This
They've
show
lost
gets tens
Brazil.
of millions of viewers. We count up all the distribution, foreign distribution, and G News. And the comments that get over 50%, 70% of the show is international viewers who are part of the Trump revolution who back it, whether it's in India, whether it's in Italy. Our audience in Australia is huge, and they want to fight. They don't want to back down. They understand. This is why we said the other night, we had our partners, G News and GTV. We said, hey, this is, our military officers saying this is the most important election in America in the history of the Republic. Well, guess what? It's the most important election in 5,000 years in China, right? And the Chinese had a huge apparatus. They had a great, the G News GTV guys with Luda and the team just did a fantastic job. Okay, I want to bring in now one of the smartest guys in this movement, Darren Beattie. Darren, before I ask you about Color Revolution, Sam Fettis just teed you up, the CIA officer, in the last segment. But I got to go to where do you think we stand today? And I particularly then want to go to this tweet that you had out earlier. I'm still not banned from reading tweets, by the way. I can still read them. So I want to go to I want to go to this tweet that you said guys in the House are getting lit up. Their staffs are getting lit up by phone calls by angry Trump supporters. So where do you think we stand in this whole thing? Pull the camera back. You're one of the smartest guys that can always put perspective on things. Where do we stand in this before we start talking about the color revolution?
Right. Well, look, that's an excellent question. And in times of crisis like this, you figure out who your real friends are. Now, unfortunately, I don't need to tell you, but Trump in 2016 didn't only run against Hillary Clinton. He ran against the corrupt establishment apparatus of the Republican Party. And they really never gave up that fight. They've been trying to sabotage him really since day one. And I think you can see that persistent attitude in their reluctance to stand up for Trump in this hour of need, in this hour of crisis. At the very best, you're seeing lip service paid, so on Twitter and so forth, but you really don't get any sense of an energized willingness to fight this out and to make sure that every single legitimate vote is counted, no more, no less. And in fact, if you look at the incentive structures, it's actually in the incentive of a lot of these establishment GOP people, unfortunately, for Trump to simply lose, and they take up this fake fight against Biden for the next 4 years. I think many of them actually want him to lose.
What's your? How do you get a sense of that? Tell me how you come to that. You're a pretty analytical guy. How do you come to that conclusion?
Well, I mean, I don't know how many names I should name, but the Senate Majority Leader, for instance, why wouldn't he want Trump to lose? He becomes the key figure. He's going to be the guy that Biden has to go to negotiate for everything, to compromise with. He's the de facto leader in government who will be calling all the shots, Biden himself, look, you've seen this through all these national security, quote unquote, national security professionals for Biden, the whole washed up, discredited, and disgraced George W. Bush apparatus. I bet you anything, Biden would be more than happy to throw them a bone or two. And so they're going to be most comfortable in a Biden administration. They won't have to deal with Trump. They've always done it reluctantly and at best. And I think from the standpoint of a lot of the leadership, unfortunately, that's really sabotaged him in every dimension, really, except for judges, will be more than happy to have Trump go away, which they consider as a nuisance, and to go on with, continuing this charade with Biden where they can cooperate with him and have this kind of public spectacle of a fight, but really be in more comfortable territory anyway.
You don't think Mitch McConnell's is out there adamantly enough right now defending the president, or you think that Don Jr. called out the 2024 guys yesterday? Do you think they're doing enough? Chris Christie, some of the guys that quote unquote are the president's best friends, Rick Santorum, on these guys on CNN and WABC. Just walk down. You don't think they're being, and if they're not, tell me what you would want them to do if you're an elected official.
Right. Well, look, in terms of what they want to do, there's a piece that laid it out very clearly on Revolver.news that's exploding, making the rounds. The president read it. A lot of people in the White House read it. Congress has read it. And it makes the case very clearly. You need to battle it out in the courts to the greatest degree possible, which they're doing to a degree. The next step is there needs to be pressure, at least, on state legislatures to entertain the possibility of seating pro-Trump electors as a last resort if it is not clear that all legitimate votes are being counted, no more, no less. They have that authority. That is a precedent set from Bush v. Gore that needs to be taken very seriously. There's another component, I think, and this is the narrative war. And this ties into the color revolution scenario that I've been calling out at Revolver.news since day one. I've never been as disappointed to have been proven so prescient, because this is exactly what's going on. And the key to the color revolution victory here is that the left side, the Democrat side, their friends in the media and big tech who censored you, they need to coalesce this narrative. They need to sediment in our minds this idea that Joe Biden is the default president-elect. If they're able to do that, they can then more effectively reframe every effort of Trump to stop the steal, if indeed there was a steal, to stop the steal as his attempt at a coup. And so I think you're going to see all the news organizations, including Fox, they're getting ready to declare it for Biden today, precisely in order to sediment and solidify this narrative of Biden as president-elect. Any GOP person who accepts this narrative, acquiesces to it, even tacitly, is stabbing Trump in the back and the tens of millions of voters who supported him on Election Day.
What, as you see the fight, I mean, you're a strategy guy. Walk us through you talked about state legislatures. You talk about, they got to certify this vote. You can go have a contingent election in the House. Given that you may have some establishment Republicans or country club Republicans who may be a little weak-kneed about this and don't know if they really want to get a fight. They're probably afraid they're going to get thrown out of the country club. Tell me, how would you do this? What's your strategy? How would you go forward?
Well, it's as I laid out. The number one important thing, I think, is actually the narrative war, because once they sediment the idea that Joe Biden is the president-elect, it's going to be very, very difficult to recapture that narrative. So they need to be doing everything they can to preempt that narrative. And again, a lot of these GOP people, very quiet. If you notice what they're talking about anything but the most uncomfortable and most important question, which is this proving to be a legitimate election? Are we exploring all the irregularities that we're seeing in the various swing states, or are we not? And there's a serious discomfort to discuss this and to undermine the left's attempt to sediment the idea that Joe Biden is the president-elect. That's the number one thing. Number two is I think they do need to be exploring this issue of state legislatures using their authority to seat pro-Trump electors in cases where it looks like justice and democracy has not been done. They need to explore that possibility, and they need to have full court press on the legal side, on the courts, make sure that they're not leaving any stone unturned, anything on the table in terms of this legal fight. Because again, as I've been predicting, the color revolution, Revolver.news, they were going to do everything they can to make sure the election is decided in the streets or the courts, because they can't win it fair and square at the ballot box. And that's precisely what you see playing out right now, right before our eyes.
Tell people real quickly, what's the color revolution? How did you get this term of art? And we've had you on the show for months talking about, warning people about it. You said this day's coming. The day's here. Walk through what it is.
Right. Well, in a nutshell, it's a specific type of regime change model favored by certain elements of our national security apparatus. It has two chief characteristics. One of those characteristics is an engineered contested election scenario. And like I've been saying, this was guaranteed to happen with this mail-in ballot nonsense. There was no conceivable way that some type of contested election fiasco would not happen given how they've set this up. That's just the nature of it. And they wanted to set it up because it provides precisely the context for this color revolution and for all the types of shenanigans that we're learning about now that may or may not have happened, the evening of the election when everyone was asleep at 4 or 5 in the morning. I was telling the Trump people, I was telling the campaign people, do not go to sleep. Do not shut your eyes, because the second you shut your eyes at 4 or 5 in the morning, that's when the mice come out to play. I won't say rats, but that's where the mice come out to play. And all of a sudden you have, Trump's advantages in all these key states mysteriously evaporated.
No.
And one last point.
Go ahead.
One last point I want to sneak in, that no matter what happens, I think the big winner of this election is actually Florida. I'm very impressed with Florida and how competent they've been. And one key aspect, of Florida's competence here has been they really set out to make sure, first of all, that the mail-in ballots were protected effectively, but secondly, that the mail-in ballots would be counted first. And I think that's a big issue. Is like the states that allow the mail-in ballots to be counted last are setting themselves up for failure. It's like, sending your wife off to a 4-week vacation in Bali and then being surprised that she comes back pregnant. They've left the door open for this to happen by setting it up so that the other side can figure out exactly how many ballots they need. And then mysteriously at 4 and 5 in the morning, they find the ballots. We need to be smart. We aren't playing in a field of angels here. We're playing dirty politics. The other side is playing dirty politics. We need to get smart and not let this happen.
Darren, but it's also Republican, state houses, not state houses, but the general assemblies that we control, the legislatures we control that allowed that to happen in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and other places, right? This is how we got.
That's what I'm saying. I'm criticizing our people for not being attentive and ready for what was clearly a predictable outcome here.
Darren, give us Revolver, give us your Twitter handle, give us how people get access to you.
All right, revolver.news, the president's favorite alternative to Drudge. We've been hitting it hard, like I mentioned.
Okay, that's Darren Beattie there talking to Steve Bannon. So I noticed people in the chat saying that their lefty friends and family, they're not talking about voter fraud allegations. That's because Republicans have failed to substantially provide evidence for them in the past. I mean, think about Chris Kobach. He talks about voter fraud. And he choked. He failed. He was so reckless. He was embarrassed in court. He was sanctioned for the illicit way he went about doing things. Trump did an election integrity commission. It met twice, and then it folded. And the Trump administration said, well, the work will be carried on in the Department of Homeland Security. Well, it wasn't. Republicans have failed until now to produce substantial allegations of substantial evidence for voter fraud. So that's why nobody who's not a true believer believes them now. So Chris Kobach, just everything he touches turns to dirt. He ran for governor. He failed. He ran for Senate in Kansas. He failed. He was involved with the We Build the Wall, which turned out to be a giant grift. He made all sorts of wild allegations about voter fraud, which he could not substantiate. Then he got humiliated in court. He would bring in these experts who weren't expert. So Republicans have been crying wolf about voter fraud without providing substantial evidence until now. So let's see what they can do this time. But after decades of Republicans crying voter fraud but being unable to back up their words, it's no wonder that nobody outside of true believers take them seriously today. So in inner cities, you have an awful lot of Democratic incompetence, all right? So we're usually waiting for votes from inner city Democratic strongholds on election night. And they're frequently incompetent, but we have yet to produce substantial evidence that they are stealing votes. And so it's time to put up and shut up. Looking at this article on the Washington Times today, Judicial Watch finds 1.8 million ghost voters in 29 states, warns of dirty elections. Judicial Watch has released a comparison study of Census Bureau population statistics and state voter registration data to reveal a notable disparity. The watchdog group is now warning of potential voter fraud and dirty voter rolls. That's not good enough. Right? The study found that 352 U.S. counties in 29 states managed to have 1.8 million more registered voters than eligible voting age citizens. All right. That's not enough. All right. On the face of it, yeah, that looks absolutely terrible. But we need to hear what other experts say about these statistics. So I've started reading books on voter fraud, and people devote their careers to studying this topic. And the thing that stands out to me is the very low quality, at least until now, of Republican allegations of voter fraud. So there are excellent books on this. Richard Hasen published earlier this year, Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. There's another book called The Myth of Voter Fraud. These are both highly reviewed. So it's worth getting an outside opinion on these things, not just talking to fellow true believers. All right, let's listen to recent podcasts here. Dahlia Lithwick,
trying to probe well in advance what could go wrong in a 2020 contest with fake news, mistrust in systems and institutions, dangerous, escalating nihilist rhetoric, and vote suppression, among the other things that Rick had warned us about in his book. I think it's fair to say that Rick laid the table in advance for us at Amicus and our listeners, and also later for much of the country, on how to think about election reform going forward and also how to worry about the election that has just come. And so it seems that there's nobody we would rather usher in the end, hopefully, of this election season than our dear friend and contributor, Rick Hasen. So, Rick, I know you are crazy tired. Welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be back with you.
You are very tired, I know. And I think probably America.
So I read Hasen's book, Election Meltdown, on voter fraud. And he doesn't just fault Republicans in this area. He's fairly even-handed. He faults Democrats. He faults Republicans. He is a highly regarded law professor, one of America's top lawyers, and he seems to be expert in the area of voter fraud.
Is very, very tired. As of this taping Friday morning, it looks as though Biden has locked up the votes. It has not been called yet. Are there any pathways left that you can see for Trump to take the Electoral College?
Well, I'm not someone who counts votes, so I'm going to have to rely on others who will say, when it's safe to call Pennsylvania. Probably by the time listeners hear this, it will have been called. But to the extent Trump is looking for a litigation path to try to reverse the outcome of the election, it's extremely unlikely. And I think that's true for three reasons. First, if it doesn't come down to a single state, even if there were a problem.
Okay, so Rodney keeps asking in the chat, Luke, why is voter suppression real but voter fraud a conspiracy theory according to the experts I cited? Well, where's the evidence for voter fraud? Let's forget this latest election where everything's in flux. Republicans have been talking about voter fraud for decades, but they've yet to provide substantial evidence for it. It's just been hot air. They did nothing to prepare for it in this election. So where's the evidence? Now, voter suppression is a matter of judgment. For example, if in the state of Kansas, they sent out, I believe, a letter to 30,000 new citizens asking them to come in and prove their citizenship with either a birth certificate or naturalization papers. So obviously they are making it harder for these new citizens to vote. Now, you can call that voting integrity. You can call that voter suppression. I understand both points of view. If you're taking extraordinary steps to make new citizens, make it much more difficult for them to vote based on the idea that Republicans have the power in Kansas, and so they understand that these new American citizens are not likely to vote for them, so they're going to make it more difficult for them to vote, it doesn't seem irrational to call that voter suppression. It also does not seem irrational to me to call that protecting voting integrity. Republicans simply have not produced substantial evidence that tens of thousands of people are voting illegally, voting fraudulently, that non-citizens in large numbers are voting in American elections. The evidence may be there. Republicans have not produced it. Rodney says that is not suppression. You make 30,000 new citizens come in and produce a whole bunch of documents, right? That is definitely making their voting more difficult. And if you provide some pretty stiff warnings with the letter, yeah, you're going to intimidate these people from voting. So I think voter suppression is one way of describing it. And if you're a Republican, you'd say, oh, they're just struggling for voting integrity. So Chris Kobach went to court on this matter, and he lost because he could provide no evidence that there was a substantial danger in Kansas of non-citizens voting. He was sanctioned by the court. His experts were terrible. His court case was terrible. His conduct was embarrassing. So it's very easy to talk a big game about voter fraud, but if you don't produce, then that's pathetic. Rodney says those new citizens may not be sworn yet. If they're not sworn in yet, are they really citizens? So you can look at the Chris Kobach lawsuit. He was sued in Kansas, and he performed terribly. So he's had every opportunity to back up his big talk about millions of illegals voting in the United States. He's never come even close. He couldn't even provide examples of 500 illegals voting. He couldn't even provide examples of 50 illegals voting. All he does is talk big and talk tough, like many other Republican activists, but they have always failed to come through with substantial evidence. So therefore, they look bad, and therefore, anyone who's not a true believer in Trump and the Republican Party right now does not take seriously these allegations of voter fraud. Okay, Dooovid, what's going on, man?
Thank God, Shavua Tov. Pretty
Shavua
crazy
Tov.
out there.
Yeah. Any thoughts about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris being dubbed, at least by the news media, as the president-elect?
Yeah, it's pretty unreal, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I was just looking at Twitter, and like all of President Trump's, almost all of his tweets are blocked. All of the news, just Biden's our president. It would appear that the claims against voter fraud are probably inaccurate. If you want to say that it was the mail-in voting that did it, that may be accurate, and whether there's still any legal battles out that possibly give Trump a legal fight, that the whole mail-in concept in the first place was flawed. I don't imagine they're going to catch any large voter fraud. I mean, there are a lot of eyes on it. It seems pretty unlikely that they would be able to dump thousands, tens of thousands of ballots anywhere. And from my knowledge, like you've been saying, we've agreed that the leftists are more active. And I said on Charles Moskowitz, 2018, Michigan already prepared for this in 2018. They already passed the legislation for mail-in voting. And the activists have been knocking on doors and getting these people registered for years and saying, I know because, I'm a Jew. The majority of my friends are liberal. They're active. They were doing this. So I would not be surprised if the results are indicative of things that were done within the law. And there might be some sort of challenge on mail-in voting that would seem to be Trump's only source, or it could be Rodney, this is some sort of faction Trump doesn't concede, and people don't want to accept the demographic or different implications of what just happened. The underlying, Trump and the dog whistles, Jefferson Lee, I guess, Richard Spencer is still not really around, but I was listening to Jefferson Lee and this failed Republican strategy just didn't work. If he's using dog whistles, it didn't work. And if this was a vote for multiculturalism, this was a vote for immigration, or this was just, maybe those disputes will still remain unresolved. And the real question was, does Donald Trump cost himself the election? If he had just not been such a moron, not such an idiot, not such a vulgar person, he would have won an easy re-election. The only person that there is to blame is, his own bad character.
Yeah, so I want to make it clear there are a lot of allegations of voter fraud right now. And so for this election, I don't know, because it's just way too fluid. I want to see the allegations, and then I want to see the rejoinders. So I'm saying up until now, up until the 2020 election, Republicans have talked about voter fraud, but they haven't provided evidence. And when they've been taken to court, they have failed. They've looked idiotic, that Donald Trump, with Chris Kobach in charge, developed a voter integrity commission. It only met twice. It fell apart. It accomplished nothing. It was highly partisan. It was not the best and the brightest. Now, we've had electoral commissions before. We had two, I believe, with James Baker and President Jimmy Carter after the 2000 election and after the 2004 election. So when you gather leading minds from both parties and you have a bipartisan approach to voter integrity, that's one thing. But that is not what Trump did. So if fraud was anything like the problem that Trump kept talking about, he kept talking about the elections rigged. Well, he had the opportunity, but he never came through with the evidence. Rodney, what's going on? Rodney Martin?
Hey, Luke. A couple of things. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
How's my sound?
Good.
Hey, a couple of things. First of all, with regard to the non-citizen and the sworn comment that I made, and I'm going to use a most recent example. Mehdi Hasan, you're familiar with the Mehdi Hasan. He's a commentator. He's been on Al Jazeera. He's now over in the United States. He moved to the United States a couple years ago. And miraculously, he sought U.S. citizenship, and he's got it expedited. And he did a podcast, a video in which he said he had sought American citizenship and had gotten all the preliminary certificates and documents, getting approval, but he was worried that he would not get sworn in time to cast a vote. I mean, he got the official document saying he'd been approved and was going to be an American citizen. And but until you are sworn by that INS judge, you are not an American citizen. And this has been the point by a lot of secretaries of state, not just Kobach. And by the way, I will admit Kobach has proved himself to be an idiot and a horrible candidate on par with Martha McSally. But that point aside, even this is one of the points with then Governor Pete Wilson in Prop 187, points with Arizona's version when they were seeking to do a very similar measure, in that new citizens, as you call them, would show these initial paperwork, and then the question would be, have you been sworn? And of course, there would be deer in the headlights. So they wanted to verify that they'd actually been sworn and had completed the process. So yeah, you can show paperwork that you're a citizen or going to be a citizen, but it's that paperwork that has the actual judge's stamp on it that shows you've been sworn. That's what these secretaries of state, not just Kobach, but other states, have sought to make people produce. The initial approval document, ratification document, does not make you a U.S. citizen. That will say you are a citizen subject to your swearing-in ceremony. And of course, most recently with COVID, a lot of those swearing ceremonies were backlogged, and that is what Mehdi Hasan was complaining about. Even though he had gotten his certificate, he would not be an official citizen until he had sworn and taken the oath. Now, that aside, as far as voter fraud, there are historical. The problem with voter fraud is a lot of times you don't get it proven, dead to rights until years after the election. I've used these cases on your show, Lyndon Johnson and such, but there are some really good cases and points of evidence in the litigation that is being filed by the Trump campaign and by some of the state parties recently. And I was not going to say this on your show or anyplace else, but litigation was filed today, and one of my own declarations and police reports has been used in that litigation in Maricopa County. When I went to vote in person, Luke, I was initially questioned because when you go down to register in Maricopa County in person, the enabling document in Arizona, in Maricopa County, or in every county that you have to use, it allows you to register to vote both voluntarily and then to get you to a ballot at the polls, is your Arizona driver's license. So you have to have a valid Arizona driver's license, and you put in your information, and that enables you to register to vote. And then you go to the polls, and that matches against your voter registration. When I went to register to vote, I found out that, I gave him my ID and my address. I went to where I would vote in Scottsdale, and found out that my Arizona driver's license was linked to a gentleman, Hispanic gentleman, registered as a Democrat in Tolleson, Arizona. And I had to do a declaration. I also did a police report, and ended up having to vote provisional, which was ultimately accepted because they give you a barcode to make sure you can check the status of your ballot. If it's not accepted, you can further challenge it. Now, I didn't have to because right then and there, I called the police department to the polling place, showed them what was going on so they could take a real-time report and show that my credentials had been compromised by, what would be otherwise be known as voter fraud and identity theft. So I know this is real because I'm subject to it this election. This has never happened to me before in a prior election. I've been a voter for many, many, many years, since I was 18, never missed an election. But something has gone awry this time.
Okay, Dooovid, any thoughts? I saw you made some comments in the chat, so why don't you articulate them now?
Yeah, I was separating between voter fraud, which I don't think is going to work. I mean, it looks like, from what I've seen, that Trump doesn't have any chance of somehow getting the election in his favor based on voter fraud. His only chance is to have mail-in voting in totality ruled somehow in his favor by the Supreme Court, that there would have to be some technicality or some reason that one of these court cases against mail-in voting or the way that the states carried it out violates some code or section of the law that would make its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would be able to toss out the mail-in votes from multiple states. So that, from my understanding, that's Trump's only path to victory. And just the fact that, Trump might mention voter fraud, and I see Trump losing because I don't see him being a good spokesperson for himself.
Hey, the election results are coming in, and the win
being able to control the narrative, but it could be sloppy. And it depends what the Republicans and like the courts, if these states, what it looks like, if there's states in the large people that be like, no, we're not going to get behind Biden, we're going to fight, and what kind of momentum Trump could get to ride. But I wouldn't imagine that Trump, huffing and puffing and claiming to have done more for America than everybody is going to get the Supreme Court on his side, even if they could get it to his case. So like I don't see Trump's personality changing over the next few months, and I don't see the Republicans or the Supreme Courts or even Barrett teaming up to do such a thing. So it's just a question whether there's a peaceful transition, and there might not be. You could see the forces that be Trump or others that at this point there's enough reason America's power has been diminished enough that it doesn't pay to have a peaceful transmission of power that's going to change America too much, God forbid.
Oh, Luke, a
Yes.
couple of things. The Supreme Court's already involved, and it's tracking the same way that it tracked in Florida. If you remember correctly, in Florida in 2000, there was an emergency request for action in Florida, and all that requires is one justice to act. And at that time, it was then Justice Scalia who granted an emergency action to review and to put a temporary hold. In this case, Pennsylvania it's well known, it's acknowledged, Pennsylvania violated its own statute. First of all, it modified election law without going through the legislature. So that's challenge number one. But then also it was supposed to, according to its own election law, segregate the ballots from your overseas absentee ballots. Then the vote by mail ballots are supposed to be segregated, and then your election day ballots. Pennsylvania admittedly refused to do that. Justice Scalia, there was a special emergency request brought to him yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, and he accepted it and issued an initial order ordering Pennsylvania to segregate those ballots so they could be reviewed. Now, in this case, then to follow up with that would be where the Trump campaign or the Republican Party could challenge those ballots and throw a portion of them out or all of them out, ask them to be reviewed. That would again take Pennsylvania out of the Biden column. But again, as I've said previously, and then of course a very similar case was filed this evening about 4:00 in Maricopa County for almost the exact same issue that was going on, with the exception of how provisionals and the fact that there was some duplicate ballots issued. In my case, I'm one of the duplicate ballots. But beyond that, this has never been, you're not going to get, and I agree with Dooovid, Trump's own character and the way he handles himself is not helpful, but Trump has been relatively quiet. You've not seen it. He was out golfing today. He has been letting his legal team do the work, bringing witnesses forward, submit what they have seen. So Trump has been conducting himself the way that a good lawyer would want their client to act. But what I've said all along is the purpose of litigation is to sufficiently cloud, to create a sufficient enough dispute on these ballots and sufficient enough states, which is only going to take 3, which would enable the state legislatures in those 3, maybe 4, but it's only going to take 3 states to then say, okay, these ballots are so disputed that they can't be relied upon. So we are not going to appoint the electors based on these ballots. We're going to appoint them. And that's where I think that's the path that Trump is going to take. And if he gets a win from Alito's case, where Pennsylvania says the Supremes tell Pennsylvania that they improperly handled their ballots because they violated their own law, which they've already stipulated to, that's even better. But by the way, Luke, finally, not a single Republican, except Mitt Romney, has jumped on board with this premature Biden declaration today. You know, Biden was declared president by the mainstream media. He has not been declared by any of the states. He's not been ratified, and the state secretaries of states have not called their states either.
Yeah. So, Dooovid, you're asking if demographics are destiny. In part, all right. People can surprise you. Think of the high, relatively high for a Republican Black and Latino turnout that Trump got. So, also the Democratic Party coalition is highly unstable because the Democrats have become the Black Party, and Latinos and Asians have not a lot of joy in that. So Blacks, Latinos, Asians, gays, transsexuals, this is a highly unstable party. And so we'll start to see, now that they occupy the White House, in all likelihood, we'll start to see some serious divisions. But Dooovid, do you want to say anything on, is demographics destiny?
Yeah, and just because that's one of the main topics we talked about the last few years, and now we're seeing it here, you know, with Frame Games, who you warned of Texas turning blue, which didn't happen yet, but you were seeing that this was predicted, and came true, and everything that Trump said. And multiculturalism, you're saying that the win for Biden is basically a win for multiculturalism, a win for the vision of the nation of immigrants. And if you're going to take the Democratic measure, demographics was destiny, and the majority of America stood up and said, this is America, multicultural land of immigrants. There's a lot of other things happening also, and it's going to be a mess. I mean, the state of the country, the economy, the deficit, COVID-19, and just the likelihood that Biden is factually incompetent, and how anybody could not have known it. It really shows the weakness of our system. That we're sitting here looking at President Joe Biden, and Trump is just appears to be like a blithering moron to some level. Like, was he really getting up there night after night saying he's done more for Black people than Abraham Lincoln? Did he mean it? Was he serious? Maybe it's hard to know. And but if you say voter fraud, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unknowns, and I would be skeptical that just the media say like, yeah, the Trump's been saying it for a few years, and say like, no, I would not put it past our media to have rigged the election, unfortunately. And like the way the media is doing it right now, to me, like you said, it makes it worse. Like, no, it's not official. Biden is just the presumptive from the vote count. It's not official till December, when they actually, the electors vote. And so it makes it look like it's a charade. Twitter and everyone, coming together, it looks like a conspiracy. Honestly, like from, like an intelligent person just looking at it, I'm more likely to assume there's some sort of conspiracy that I'm trying to figure out than like the vast majority of American people are rallying around Joe Biden, but even Donald Trump to that matter. So, how do we move forward, keep on analyzing it into the certain perspective that, like, as a skeptic, a lifelong libertarian, I don't really think it matters. Like, either one of these people, basically, government is corrupt, and who's ever at the helm is, but I don't know. I mean, you're the news analyst, Luke. You're the one who covers the news every night. You got to give us the insight.
That's where I got Rodney. Rodney, how do you expect Joe Biden to govern? I would expect him to be kind of center left. Joe Biden was the most moderate of all the Democratic nominees for president.
Well, first of all, I'm not expecting him to govern because I'm still holding out hope that the Republicans will maintain their testicle sack and convene and let the state legislatures pick those electors. But a couple of things. First of all, Joe Biden is not a moderate. Joe Biden was the one that pushed Barack Obama into supporting homosexual marriage. Joe Biden tried to present publicly. He tried to do this old, what they used to call the LBJ two-step. LBJ would call up his, Southern senators and put on an even deeper Southern drawl to try to get their votes. But they began to truly understand that he had just morphed into a Northern liberal in cowboy boots. And so Biden is not a centrist. He is on board. Keep in mind, he publicly made a public gaffe in the second debate, or the third, depending if you want to count the canceled second one, where he committed to phasing out fossil fuels. That's not a moderate position by any means. It would cripple the U.S., would devastate the U.S. economy. So, but also, I wanted to make light of something. In his speech tonight, Joe Biden just cannot help himself. He plagiarized again. He plagiarized Barack Obama's 2000 speech. He just can't even do his own work. He talked about being a president in red states and blue states. That's Barack Obama's 2004 speech. Joe Biden can't even do his own speech. So what Biden has done is, as the Democratic Party has shifted left, he's just gotten right on that train and gone left with it. The Democratic Party was shifting further to the left than even Barack Obama was willing to go when he was vice president. And it was Biden that pushed him into a lot of these leftist positions. Biden did not even want to approve or sign on to the raid that took out the guy that attacked 9/11. Biden
Osama
was
bin
against
Laden,
that.
yeah.
Osama bin Laden. That's who I meant. So let's keep that in mind. This was a guy that wanted to divide Iraq into 3 or 4 countries, probably so he can send his cokehead son over there to cut deals with 3 new governments. So Biden is a liberal. Granted, he comes across as a moderate, but he is a LBJ liberal. He is lockstep with that progressive agenda because he said so in that last debate. We know exactly where he is. His selection of Kamala Harris puts him on record as charting the future of the Democratic Party. If he was a true moderate, he never would have selected Kamala Harris as his vice president.
And Dooovid, how do you think Joe Biden is going to govern? You think he might even retire a couple of years into his term?
Yeah, I don't really see him being capable or competent. It's like he looked like he was suffering like almost senileness a year ago, and even just looking at him tonight, like I was looking at him pointing at the fireworks afterwards. Honestly, like I just can't see this man capable of governing. Period. I mean, I don't know. Obviously I'm biased. I don't have any insider information, but just looking at it, I can't picture Biden governing. And I don't picture there being a unifying country moment. Even Biden is probably better off with the "we win, you lose" than that he's going to governor for all America. I can't imagine with this divisive election that the Reds or the Republicans aren't going to be anything than obstruct, or are going to compromise. I mean, they might bankrupt us. Like, God forbid, I would not be surprised if Biden gets in and the first thing they do is just bankrupt the country on like some sort of coronavirus Green New Deal, and that the Republicans somehow would just get suckered into agreeing to that. No, I mean, I have to admit, I have absolutely zero confidence in Biden having any success in governing. Maybe some sort of Clinton miracle where a divided House if the Republicans have some sort of level and there's like a whole bunch of series of government shutdowns, they might be able to balance the budget. That'd be the miracle in my vision, that there's not like balkanization or complete breakdown, but that you just have multiple government shutdowns, and the Republicans, by playing chicken on government shutdowns, would be able to somehow like get like a balanced budget or a working government till maybe the midterm elections. Will there be like a red shift, and or like you're just going to get President Harris? Who knows? Maybe even immediately. Like I could even see it happening before the swearing in. That I mean, do you see like it's just a health?
Yeah, he
I don't
could
know.
trip and fall in the shower and die.
God forbid,
God
but like
forbid. Yeah, Rodney.
You know what's interesting about these elections? Let's look at some of this. The Democrats lost 8, possibly 9 House seats. Their House majority, they don't have a true, in normal circumstances, a working majority. If they just have a couple of defections in the House, that Nancy Pelosi, if she even remains a speaker, it's not a certainty that Nancy Pelosi remains a Speaker of the House. There was this conference call that she had the day after the election, in which her members just absolutely tore her a new one. But let's look at this overall. They lost 8 seats in the House. Today in Arizona, the minority leader of the Arizona House of Representatives, Charlene Fernandez, someone that I've known for years, she resigned. The Arizona Democratic Party spent more, because all they needed to do was capture 2 seats to be the majority party in the state House of Representatives. And they spent more money than they would have normally spent on gubernatorial and Senate elections. And they came up short. They didn't get those 2 seats. So she resigned, handed it over to somebody else. So Arizona, despite it being called for Biden, remains, its state House delegation remains Republican. Its state Senate delegation remains Republican. Its congressional delegation remains Republican. And the only reason why it has 2 Democratic senators is because the Republican Party in Arizona ran the same dud twice. Now, I predict in 2 years, when that seat, the rest of McCain's seat's up again, the governor will run and they will recapture one of those seats. So there's that aside. This was not a big bellwether year and a mandate for the Democratic Party, but you would not have known that, Luke, by listening to Kamala Harris and Joe, I'm wearing my Depends extra thick tonight, Biden, by their speeches. And there was no attempt nor any interest by them to quote unquote unify and bring everybody together. In fact, they gave the same red meat stump speeches, campaign speeches that they've been given for the last 4 months. So they don't care about unifying the country, contrary to what the media, including Fox News, is saying. So Dooovid touched on balkanization. I would predict that if the country was ever going to balkanize or we're going to see actual fissures, it's probably going to be in the next year if Biden actually gets to squat and usurp the Oval Office.
And Michael Tracy tweets, the sheer amount of collective psychic energy invested in the personage of Donald J. Trump, both positive and negative, has to be unparalleled in human history. All I know is that the withdrawal period is going to be intense. Dooovid, any thoughts on what life is going to be like without constantly talking about Donald J. Trump?
Yeah, because I follow COVID-19 so much that I was listening to Dr. Fauci, and like he wouldn't say it himself, but he was saying there was a rare opportunity that someone like Dr. Fauci got to speak to so much mass of America, which is basically the celebrityness of Donald Trump. That when Donald Trump did a press conference with Dr. Fauci, there tens of millions of people tuned in, and under any other scenario, the people wouldn't have turned into Dr. Fauci. Biden and Dr. Fauci doing a press conference would probably not even break 1 million people. And so that matter, Donald Trump is one of the most famous people in the history of the world. Even before Donald Trump became president, I had said that Ivanka Trump's conversion to Judaism was a huge significant event, one of the biggest conversions in the history of Judaism, even before he became president. So that celebrity aspect, Biden will be boring. No one's going to care. Like if Trump, God forbid he's right, Biden's largely failed his whole electoral life and will probably continue to fail, and the American public will not have that much interest in obstructionist politics. And at best, the compromise is just going to be, giving our money away and getting further into debt. I don't see any way to, the decline of America. The market remains high, kind of like a corporate capitalistic. There's a lot of different scenarios that America could go down based on what's going to happen. Like they don't all have to be catastrophic, and there could be a lot of decline of the federal government, decline of the government, balkanization, or various things that also don't have to be catastrophic. As you see, the market remains high, and it's like, is the power grid going to go down? Is the internet going to go down? And you can see, there could be election dispute for months, but maybe at the same time the internet doesn't go down once. But at the same time, like the power grid goes down, that's going to be a big deal, especially in the cold winter here in places like Michigan.
Rodney, did you want to add anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I know you've asked for evidence. I saw something earlier today, and I checked it out. In Philadelphia, there were 189 persons age 118 to age 121 that were issued ballots and were shown to have voted. Now, I would like to meet just one or two of them, because I would like to just meet and see a 118-year-old to 120-year-old person living and breathing. I mean, I'd like to give them, a free package of Depends, just for, being around that long. Now, that just seems just a little sketchy to me, that you have people on the voter rolls at that age and being issued ballots for the 2020 election.
Yeah, there are dozens of things that look incredibly sketchy right now. I want to see them collected, and I want to see them analyzed, and I want to see them critiqued, and I want like something strong, something that stands up in court, or some really substantial legal pleading. I mean, is Trump putting A-class lawyers on this, or is this just a sop for Trump's ego and he's sending out the B team? Rodney?
Okay, now today there was word that he was in talks with Michael Mukasey, the former attorney general. He's a former federal judge, that he was going to come on board as an attorney. Getting back, though, to the example I just gave, here's the problem, Luke. If you were to go out and say, look, I want to meet one of these 120-year-old voters, the mainstream media wouldn't take that as, well, that's kind of edgy. That doesn't look too right. They would immediately attack me for, criticizing and attacking the elderly. That's the problem you face with voter fraud when you're challenging the democratic machine that has effectively used it as a tool, for 150 years.
Right,
it's kind of like the
It can be done, and if the
I agree,
Republicans blow a lot of hot air, but they have not produced on this issue. They talk about it nonstop for decades, but they have not produced.
Let's go a little bit further. I don't think here's where I think the win is legally, and let's narrow it to Pennsylvania. I think you have different issues in the different states. I think you have, for instance, in Pennsylvania, Trump wins because they violated their own election law. First of all, they changed the procedure when the state law, administratively, when the state law says only the legislature can. And then two, a federal court had ruled they had to segregate the ballots, and they just refused and stipulated, we didn't do that. We just didn't want to. And that was a result of Justice Alito's issuing an order to go back now and and segregate all of them. Okay, I think that is what they should focus it on there. And then in so doing and investigating that, you can track voter fraud. But keep in mind, violating your own procedure often results in a spoiled action as well. So you focus on that. In Maricopa County, I think they do two things. One, they count the votes, all of the votes, and I think Trump will win there, one. And then two, they focus on these votes that were not counted because they had the double. They say, oh, that person already voted. Like my case where they say, oh, we think you already voted. No, I didn't. I've never lived in Tulsa. I had to jump through extra, which I ultimately prevailed in voting because I took the steps to follow up to make sure my vote was counted, where other people, they didn't find out till after the fact that they didn't. So I think you follow difference. I think I do agree it would be foolhardy to, what's the old saying, Luke, bet all your eggs in one basket. I think there's different issues in at least 3 different states. We need to pursue those, but ultimately get it to December and then let the state legislatures appoint the electors and say, screw it, and go on and win.
Dooovid, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't see exactly. I mean, if it looks like Trump is losing multiple states here, and in order for Trump to remain being president, there's going to have to be 2 or 3 states that are going to have the election results flipped. And from a legal perspective, that means multiple lawsuits combined, maybe ruled separately by the Supreme Court or combined into one case where the Supreme Court would make some sort of ruling that would flip based probably on tossing out large amounts of mail-in votes in multiple states. And the exact technicality, like in Pennsylvania, I mean, there's already been a whole bunch of lawsuits filed. So it'd have to be.
Okay, it doesn't work that way, Dooovid. In Nevada, for instance, the complaint is that Clark County has accepted and counted hundreds of thousands of votes from persons that are no longer legally able to vote in Clark County. That's a different claim of action. So they have to rule on that. If those votes, if they counted votes for Joe Biden and Donald Trump for that instance, it works both ways. That's the double-edged sword of litigation. But
Yeah, I mean, so it might not even require a lawsuit. You're saying it could just be something like a simple thing that Trump has the full right to, requesting a recount.
Correct.
Or some anomalies could flip one state or two. But at this point, it looks like Trump needs multiple states flip in his favor. And if you add up like what you're talking about in these different places, yes, you could say if in totality all of these things. But I don't even think if you look at the numbers, if Georgia flipped towards Biden, or even without that, Trump is going to need some sort of argument to reject mail-in voting in totality for him to be declared the victory.
Not necessarily at all. It has to do with how votes were counted and whether they improperly counted votes, because even as late as today, they had county and state election officers going back. In Fulton County, Georgia, for instance, today, the Secretary of State and the Fulton County election officer said that they had misapplied, I think, 11,000 or 12,000 votes to Biden that shouldn't have been. It was an error, and they were having to go back now and re-verify what had been reported. So that puts Georgia back in play.
Even if what you're saying, let's say that you're right in the rules of the mail-in voting, that the mail-in voting is only valid if these procedures are carried out, and if they're not, the vote should be invalidated, that it's unlikely that will be the case. Once the votes have been cast, even if the procedures weren't carried out correctly, it's extremely unlikely they're going to invalidate large amounts of votes. And then if the Supreme Court, through even any technicality, even if it's 100% true that the clause said that these procedures aren't done, that should be invalidated, I'd have it hard to imagine that the Supreme Court even would invalidate large amounts of votes that have been cast.
They've done it before.
Wait, hang on. There's a lot of talk about Dominion software and how it caused a glitch that 6,000 votes that should have gone to Trump went to Biden. And we got a report here that an error in the unofficial results from Michigan County was caused by accidental human error, not by the Dominion software. The software did not cause a misallocation of votes. It was the result of user human error and was unrelated to a computer glitch that temporarily halted counting in Gwinnett County, Georgia, Friday night. This is according to ProPublica. Rodney, you were saying something.
Okay, while you're on Dominion software, may I ask, just pose the question, I'll pose it to you and to the chat. Why are state governments using a foreign software firm from Canada that has also contributed heavily to the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates? I think that would remove them from any consideration.
Right, but what's the full story? I mean, I'm just thinking about Anon Mishkin, who's in charge of the Fox News decision desk, and I keep hearing that he contributed to the Democratic Party, and I keep hearing that a lot. Then I dig in a little deeper and find out he's actually contributed far more to the Republicans. So this kind of thing gets distorted.
Well, I don't know, but when you have a foreign software company that has contributed heavily to one of the, which is proven to have contributed exclusively to one of the players in an election that it is providing election services. First of all, I have a problem in an era when we are talking about foreign influence in elections using a foreign software company on our elections. I wonder what a Russian company software would have been. Would that have been okay to consider? I'm just curious. Why are we even using it to begin with? Are we so brain dead in the United States we can't go over to Silicon Valley and say, give us some election software? And by the way, it doesn't appear to have helped. It doesn't appear
the poor man's perspective here, Rodney. It's unfortunate, but it's saying like, yes, of course, the government is incompetent. If the government ever does something competently, it is because they have outsourced it to a company that actually knows how to do it. So if you're talking about complicated software, the assumption is there's absolutely no way the U.S. government is going to build their own. They're going to have to outsource it to a company. And we've seen these consistent battles between the government and Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley wins almost every time. So I mean, you have this poor man's perspective where I mean, it's surprising based on your outlook that you're assuming the government could accomplish something. And I don't see it.
Dooovid, I've worked in government contracting long enough to know that most
that
of the time,
incompetent. They're incompetent.
Are you going to let me finish, Dooovid? You know, you and I both know, because I think you're an engineer. Government contracts are awarded a lot of the time based on a thing called kickbacks. Now, I'd be curious to look at the procurement offices of these state agencies and see who's living beyond their salary. It just doesn't.
Obviously, that's guaranteed. The corruption in the system.
Thank you. That's where I was going. It has nothing to do with incompetence. It has to do with corruption. And also, there's an old saying in the area of governmental ethics: if there is an appearance of a conflict of interest or an appearance of impropriety, you just don't do it. So I certainly would have not used given the politically charged atmosphere about foreign influence in elections, I certainly would not have used a foreign firm that would be used for the tabulation and posting of election results in any state. And it just so happens that it's all blue states that are using this software, or blue state controlled at this given time. By the way, several red states rejected that company for the issues that I'm bringing up. It just didn't look right. It wouldn't look right.
And in the chat, KB says, Sidney Powell says they have evidence that the Democrats use these software programs, Hammer and Scorecard, nationwide. What more would you need? So Steve Bannon's show was talking about how malicious these software programs, Hammer and Scorecard, are, and he had on some retired lieutenant general. But I know nothing more than the allegations made on this show. So you need a hell of a lot more evidence than just the say-so of one lieutenant governor and Steve Bannon saying this is very serious. Rodney.
Well, let me just wrap up on the issue of software, Luke. In 2000 and 2004, it was the Democratic Party, because I was active in that party in those two elections, that was flying all sorts of concerns about the propriety and using proper software for elections. Now, and also it used to be in the 90s, a Democratic Party that was firmly against mail-in voting. And it's just funny how things have turned full circle.
Yes, absolutely. And remember, we were told for the past 4 years that Russia essentially hacked our election system in 2016. But now to talk about hacking is to be unpatriotic, and you get banned on social media. So for 4 years, the dominant narrative by the Democrats and by the mainstream media and big tech is that the Russians hacked the 2016 election. Now to talk about hacking an election, it shows that you're some kind of wacko. So Michael Tracy, Michael Tracy tweets, so strange that Russia decided to pause its supposedly hyper-sophisticated election hacking activities when a few thousand votes in a few states could have put their collusion agent over the top. Rodney?
Well, yeah, it's just like I said, it used to be the Democrats that were. Barbara Jordan, the late Barbara Jordan, issued a part of her report on voter integrity. It said that mail-in ballots would be the end of our democracy. I'm paraphrasing her comments.
Yep. Did you? Oh, Rodney, what do you think is going to happen? I think Michael Tracy's right. The sheer amount of collective psychic energy invested in Donald Trump, both positive and negative, has to be unparalleled in human history. All I know is that the withdrawal period is going to be intense. So let's say that Trump is not reelected, so people won't be talking about Donald Trump every day. People have invested a tremendous amount of psychic energy either in favor of Trump or against Trump. That's got to leave a big empty hole in millions of lives. Any thoughts, Rodney?
Well, it's something that's unparalleled because, first of all, there's nothing that makes him have to concede. And two, if he really wanted to mess and light Joe Biden's hair on fire, he could issue, first of all, just to be safe, he could terminate his Director of Governmental Services Administration, the GSA, which is charged with interfacing between the federal government and his administration and Biden, and put in somebody like Rick Grinnell, or a real staunch loyalist, and then instruct them to not cooperate or meet or discuss or have any communication with any Joe Biden official. He could then put out really polished, if somebody could do it for him, statements telling his supporters to keep the faith, and that he's going to carry this on all the way, through the end of the year. And he could have more rallies. There's a whole lot of stuff Trump could do, because the only person that can break that bond between Trump and his supporters is Trump himself. And what I think is weighing on Trump right now, and is probably scaring the bejesus out of Joe Biden and the left, once they kind of simmer down off their depends high tonight, is just how to handle that. What if Donald Trump does any combination of those things? What if he starts going out and having rallies again? What if he tells people to keep the faith? Because he's the only one that could tell those people to stand down. The flip side is Trump's got to be thinking how he'll be perceived if he just caves in. He'll be just like any other, milquetoast Republican, and just surrenders. And surrender is just something that just does not appear to be in Donald Trump's psyche. And of course, his thing could be keep the faith. We're going to have rallies, and it wouldn't surprise. Something that Trump could be kind of laying the foundation is to never concede, but say that he's not going to, quote, divide the nation right now, and that he'll come back and fight again in 4 years. I mean, that might be his way of kind of navigating the center without losing face, and just declaring he's going to run for, a re-election in 2024, and just not divide the country right now, and to avoid people from, having street fights and all of that. I mean, I'm speculating here, but the only person that could break that bond between Trump and his supporters is Trump himself. And I don't think there's any movement. I don't think people in Trump's people want him to surrender the keys yet, by any means.
And Dooovid, you said something in the chat about Trump owes the Jews and he should do something for them before he leaves office. What do you mean, Dooovid?
Oh my God, he already has.
No, I mean, Trump hasn't nearly paid back the Jews what he owes us. And in reality, what Trump should do is, if he's going to lose and leave office, he should try to close these peace deals with Israel before he leaves office. And maybe then, because you mentioned Trump might get arrested. Like, he might not be a peaceful transition. There's a few possible scenarios, like if Trump loses and he's just out as president. One is that he goes to jail and he gets arrested and forcibly removed, and Biden's like first active president is to prosecute Trump. You have to recognize that is actually a pretty reasonable possibility. Also, possibly Trump, starts his own news thing. It's probably not even Fox News. He could do his own thing, and he would probably get bigger numbers than Biden himself, because people back to normal. It doesn't mean like trusting crooked, corrupt, incompetent politicians. So it's not like Biden as president, all of a sudden we're all going to come together and trust politicians. Trump was an anomaly that made politics interesting. So if Trump remains a personality, but like for Trump the man, you should recognize that it was largely his biggest helpers were in fact Zionists and Jews, were the ones that backed him in 1991 when he went bankrupt. The majority, his business partners, his advisors, his neighbors, the people he worked together with decades, his biggest supporters from when he first started running to president till today. Money-wise, Sheldon Adelson still gave him $75 million, even if he loses. Sheldon Adelson just himself, and say, Trump, I demand that you carry through with those deals and do something for Israel before you lose office. You're the idiot who lost. Sheldon Adelson gave him $75 million and should demand that Trump do something before he leave office for that money. And well, yeah, I am serious, actually. I mean, because yes, Trump he took the $75 million from Sheldon Adelson. He was required to do something. But no, but one last point on that. And even if you don't take like that money, like if Trump said these peace deals and everything, Trump should at least do that and say, like, I'm going to be a man. I want to leave a legacy. And these nations that are about to recognize Israel, that he's going to make sure to do that and get it done while he's still legitimately president.
Okay, Rodney.
Okay, Dooovid, do you not read the news? There are more countries now that have, in the Arab world, that have, or Muslim countries in Africa and in the Arab world, that have peace treaties and international relations and open embassies and air traffic now between their countries and the state of Israel than since the creation of the state of Israel in 1948. And we'll use Luke as a fact checker. Correct, Luke?
Yeah.
Since Trump's, okay. The U.S. Embassy is officially in Jerusalem, something all other presidents just gave lip service to. True or false, Luke?
Yeah, true.
True. Donald Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, something that no American president or administration had ever committed to or done, had always wanted Israel to eventually give back to Syria. Donald Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. True or false, Luke?
True.
It's not
so
enough.
You're telling me that Donald Trump...
It's not enough.
No. Now, let's talk about, now in terms of not having enough for the Jews, people could point out politically that it was a certain Jew by the name of Kushner that was responsible for Donald Trump losing 5% of his key voter demographic, white men. So, I mean, Dooovid, he's done more than enough for a population, a demographic that there's only 14 million in the entire globe. So, no, if he needs to do anything for anybody else, he needs to do a full pardon. He needs to do a full pardon for Michael Flynn. He needs to pardon Julian Assange as a FU to the Democratic Party, and also pardon Snowden as an FU to the Democratic Party, if we're going to go down that line. I'm not prepared to go down that line yet. And he needs to empty all the federal prisons and relocate them to Democratic cities. Of course, now, never mind. That'll just give them more voters. Never mind.
Just to put it back to you, because you didn't answer my first point about the likelihood that that President Trump ends up in prison, that for Trump's own sake, I'm going to tie it in for Trump's own sake, that he should be a man and say, I'm here to make peace between Israel and as many nations as possible before he leaves the presidency. And probably that will save him. If he did that, Biden wouldn't prosecute him. And having strong ties, having done the last thing in office to help out the Jews and Israel would probably give them a special merit to survive after this horrible loss. And even you're saying the not owing, there's a difference between Jews don't owe Trump helping him win the election. Money. We gave him money. He owes us something because we gave him money.
You owed that.
We don't we gave him bad advice. Jared Kushner tried to win the election and he failed. That doesn't mean that we gave him money. He owes something in return for it.
Okay, first of all, the Jews owed Trump that money for the embassy in Jerusalem and for the Golan Heights, which establishes just a little bit more of greater Israel. So he had that coming. Now, as far as Trump possibly going to jail, first of all, the United States has not devolved that far into a banana. We just don't jail ex-presidents. And even Joe Biden knows. Even Joe Biden knows, because he was around when Richard Nixon left office, how absolutely toxic and devastating it would be to haul a former president in, and do the ceremonial perp walk. It's all the memes, even Donald Trump knew, with all the memes of Hillary Clinton in a jumpsuit and handcuffed. Donald Trump knew how devastating that would be to the country. Joe Biden isn't stupid. He may have pre-dementia, but him and his people know that if they even dared think about such a thing, that the 71 or 72 million Trump voters, if the mere fact of Trump leaving the White House on January 20th doesn't put them on the streets, that definitely would. So there's no possibility of Trump going to prison. We just don't put ex-presidents in prison. We put congressmen in prison. Heck, Luke, we don't even put senators in prison. I can't think of a U.S. senator, with the exception of maybe one back in the Teapot Dome scandal, that went to prison. And I think most of those were cabinet secretaries, a former secretary of the Interior, and maybe one senator. But I may be wrong on that.
What about going through on these peace deals with Israel? Trump said he was going to do it, and he might be losing. So it's like, oh, that was only if I win and get reelected. What excuse does Trump have to say, I'm going to push these peace deals through right away because they're important? He's like, oh, no, that was only if I get reelected. I'm not going to be reelected president, so Israel doesn't get to make peace anymore. Sorry.
Okay, let me ask you, Dooovid, what country? Israel's already going to make a fortune with a peace agreement with the UAE. What countries do you want him to make peace with in the next 90 days? What country? Help me out.
Saudi Arabia, and I mean, really Iran. Like, really, if he could get Iran, definitely Saudi Arabia.
Wow, okay.
Like, he definitely has to push Saudi Arabia through before he leaves office. If Trump does not push Saudi Arabia through before he leaves office, like, I predict he ends up in prison.
Do you think the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia would allow the House of Saud to even do that? I mean, even they have their limitations.
Trump,
and as far as
Iran,
Trump
could push it through as his last act as president.
How do you propose to have Trump make a peace agreement between Iran and Israel when we do not even have diplomatic relations with Iran and we have sanctioned the shit out of them for 40 years? You're being unrealistic.
Well, I mean, maybe, because I really, I think we should push to rebuild the temple. Like, I think Trump's going to be out of office if we don't have the temple rebuilt in the next 90 days. Like, we're going to have to wait at least 4 years of Biden's presidency. But at least these peace deals that Trump claimed that existed, what's his excuse not to push them forward? I mean, if it was Saudi, Trump said these deals already existed. What's his excuse not to do them before he leaves office?
Hey, Dooovid, I got a suggestion. I nominate you to get on a plane and fly to Tehran and knock on the Ayatollah's door and tell him that he needs to go make peace with Israel. Let us know how that works out.
No, we're going to send you on that mission, Rodney. You and EMJ are going to be the diplomats for Israel.
Okay. I'll take care of Saudi Arabia. You go take care of Iran.
That's your task.
At least there's an American embassy in Riyadh that I can run and hide in.
Rodney, you owe the Jews. I mean, look how nice Luke was to you. The least you could do is bring peace between Israel and Iran.
Okay.
Well, I think you're more suited for that because you have this interfaith thing going on. So maybe you could be a Muslim too and go and bring.
Okay. Thanks, guys. I'm going to move on. Good to talk to both of you.
Yeah,
Take
sure.
care, Luke.
Thanks for having
Take
us
care.
on.
Have a
Take
good
care.
night.
Good night. Good night. Okay. So I want to move on here and play a little excerpt from The Wisdom of Jennifer Rubin, Washington Post columnist.
Entertainment organization that has a news outlet would hire these people. I also want to echo something that my friend EJ said. It's not only that Trump has to lose, but that all his enablers have to lose. We have to collectively, in essence, burn down the Republican Party. We have to level them because if there are survivors, if there are people who weathered this storm, they will do it again. They will take this as confirmation that, hey, it just pays to ride the waves. Look at me, I've made it through. And so up and down the ticket, federal, state, local offices, the country has to repudiate this. This has become a dysfunctional anti-government party. That is not what the country wants and what it needs. And the proof is entertainment.
Okay, so Jennifer Rubin wants to bayonet any survivors. Wow. Right, I want to go back to the Amicus podcast with Dahlia Lithwick.
I'm going to say Georgia goes to a recount, since that looks very close as of now. That wouldn't be decisive for the outcome. It's not a one-state margin. The second is, even within a state, if it came down to a particular state, you'd have to have some theory as to why the election might be overturned. So if, for example, in Pennsylvania, it's 80,000 votes, even if there's a dispute about the late arriving ballots, which was an issue that went to the Supreme Court a couple of times before the election, those ballots, if they're not decisive, that's not going to change the election outcome. Which brings me to the third point, which is that Trump, so far, his legal team has come up with basically nothing of substance. Most of the cases are about, we want observers a little closer in the rooms where they're counting the votes, or we think that some illegal votes were counted and we've got a bunch of cases of fraud. So far in those cases, they've produced no evidence of that. There was a case in Georgia where the judge rejected it. There's a case now filed in Nevada where the complaint provided no evidence. It really doesn't seem that there is a viable legal strategy to get a case to the courts that could plausibly serve as like Bush versus Gore in Florida, where it was so close that there was the potential for the election results to flip.
Can you just unpack briefly the recounts? Because some of these states have margins within which a recount is mandatory. I gather the Trump campaign has asked for a recount already in Wisconsin. All of that is, in one sense, perfectly normal. This is the system working. Is there anything to watch for in the states that are going to start to engage in recounts?
I don't think they've actually asked for the recount in Wisconsin formally, because you can't request it until the votes are certified, which hasn't happened yet. There's about a 20,000 vote margin right now in Wisconsin. And we've never seen a statewide recount that's flipped anywhere near that number of votes. Statewide recounts generally fail. The average number of votes that change in a statewide recount is 282, according to a study looking at this over, I think, a couple of decades by Fair Vote. You're not going to change an election outcome that's 20,000 votes apart, absent finding some massive problem in how the election was conducted. And there's been no evidence of any problem in how Wisconsin or any of the states have run their elections. You'll find a small problem here or there, but to overturn an election, you'd have to have some kind of massive failure. And fortunately, we didn't have that. Some of the nightmare scenarios that we talked about, like a cyber attack that knocks out the power in a city in a swing state, it didn't happen. And
Okay, looking at an article here by Zero Hedge. In 30 states, a computer system known to be defective is tallying votes. Further down the Dominion voting system rabbit hole, Politico reports that a technology glitch that halted voting in 2 Georgia counties on Tuesday morning was caused by a vendor uploading an update to their election machines the night before. Voters were unable to cast machine ballots for a couple of hours in Morgan and Spalding counties after the electronic devices crashed. The counties used voting machines made by Dominion Voting Systems and electronic poll books used to sign in voters made by No Ink. Neither Dominion nor No Ink have responded to requests for comment. How much money did Dominion Voting Systems donate to the Clinton Foundation? $2.25 million. All right, so let me play some clips here about Dominion, the software glitches, what the heck was going on. American Thinker, the publication, has talked a lot about this, and Kyle Becker has tweeted about it.
If all this wasn't enough, in Antrim County, ballots were counted for Democrats that were meant for Republicans, causing a 6,000 vote swing against our candidates. The county clerk came forward and said tabulating software glitched and caused a miscalculation of the votes. Since then, we have now discovered that 47 counties use this same software in the same capacity. Antrim County had to hand count all of the ballots, and these counties that use this software need to closely examine their results for similar discrepancies. The people of Michigan deserve a transparent and open process.
Okay, so the election software in Michigan that switched 6,000 votes from Trump to Biden is called Dominion. It is used in 30 states, including Nevada, Arizona, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, every single major swing state. Just pause for a moment. Consider that a widespread election software system that was used in virtually every swing state in the 2020 election is called Dominion. How does an election software company named Dominion get used in almost 30 states, 4 of the top 10 counties, 9 of the top 20 counties? Dominion is used in Michigan, where votes were switched from Trump to Biden. NBC raised the alarms on Dominion voting systems in early 2000. In Texas, Dominion voting systems was turned down 3 times for certification in state elections, listed numerous reasons why the system had major security issues. Dominion is now linked to voting irregularities in both Michigan and Georgia. Early on in 2020, the Democrats held a hearing with 3 major private election vendors, including Dominion Voting Systems. The Democratic chair revealed voting components from China, widespread internet hacking,
Many have
and vulnerability
concerns
in
about
WAS.
voting systems with remote access software, and I think we want to make sure that companies no longer sell voting machines that have network capabilities. In 2019, according to a report in Motherboard, a group of election security experts, they uncovered that back-end election systems in at least 10 states were connected to the internet, despite one company's claim that its systems were not. We need also to understand supply chains. In December 2019, a study released by Interos, a supply chain monitoring company, showed that 1/5 or 20% of the components in a popular voting machine came from China-based companies. Furthermore, close to 2/3, or actually 59%, of suppliers within that machine's supply chain had locations in either China or Russia. I've also heard concerns about the ownership and control of voting machine vendors. Public reporting indicates that all 3 of the major voting system vendors represented here today are privately held or are partially controlled by private equity firms. I believe it's in the public interest for Congress to better understand who could financially benefit from the administration of our elections. Securing our elections should not be a partisan issue. Election security is about upholding a democracy of, by, and for the people, the American people, be they Republican, Democratic, third party, or no party at all.
And the Michigan State Legislature is going to hold a hearing on Saturday, apparently, about fraud claims regarding the presidential election. And here is an expert in electoral fraud, UC Irvine election law professor Rick Hasen, talking to Dahlia Lithwick of Slate magazine.
So fortunately, the election went off much better than it could have in a pandemic. And so trying to use a recount or something to attack a clean election is unlikely to succeed unless we have a situation like Georgia, where, as of the time that we're taping, the candidates were separated by fewer than 2,000 votes. There's at least the potential that something could change.
But Georgia won't matter if Pennsylvania is called. So even that goes back into your world of it won't make a difference in that one state.
That's right. If the votes hold as they might, we'd have Biden at, I think, 306 electoral college votes. And that gives him some cushion because he needs only 270.
Rick, you talked at the very top about these lawsuits that are being filed seemingly kind of willy-nilly. There's a way in which, I guess in Michigan, they actually filed in the wrong court. In one of the Pennsylvania suits this week, the judge wasn't even clear what the relief was that they were seeking. I mean, this just is not the A-team, right? This is not James Baker and Ben Ginsburg and, serious election lawyers going in. This feels like it's, as you noted, I think on Twitter, some of the rehashed vote fraud squad lawyers we haven't seen since Bush v. Gore, and some people who don't seem to know what they're doing. And it all seems to be masterminded by Pam Bondi and Rudy Giuliani. I think when you and I have been talking the last few weeks about the possibility that this ends in the courts and this ends at the Supreme Court, we anticipated that this would be done, if it were to be done, by serious lawyers bringing serious claims. What does it signal that the conservative legal establishment has just utterly washed their hands of this enterprise?
Well, I think it's worth contrasting what is happening with the suit that went to the Supreme Court twice already on the late arriving ballots with all of these other lawsuits.
In Pennsylvania.
Yes. So there was an effort before the election to try to roll back a change that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ordered, which extended the deadline for the receipt of ballots by mail in Pennsylvania from Election Day at 8 p.m. to 5 p.m. on November 6th, a 3-day extension. And there was an argument, and we can talk about the details of it, but it was an argument about this potentially being the state Supreme Court taking power away from the state legislature to set the deadlines. And that case was seriously litigated. The Supreme Court weighed in on it twice. You had serious lawyers on those sides. And if, in fact, Pennsylvania came down to those votes, I think, we could imagine a world in which the A-team would come out and would litigate that stuff. But all of the other lawsuits that we've seen so far, you don't have the Paul Clements coming out. You don't have the Ted Olsons, the top drawer former solicitors general who bring these suits and bring a kind of gravitas. Instead, you have these small suits. And the reason I think that these lawyers are not getting involved is because these are not cases that could potentially lead to a difference in the outcome. Some of these cases are premised on faulty factual assertions. So, for example, there was a case in Georgia the other day where the claim was that some votes that arrived after Election Day were being counted. And it was based on the affidavit of a single election observer who didn't really observe anything, and the judge just threw it out. There was another case brought in federal court in Pennsylvania involving how many observers could be back in the rooms where they're counting the ballots. And the federal judge was exasperated because he said, you're making it sound like there are no people in there. Are there any people? And the Trump lawyer said, there's a non-zero number of observers. And I mean, it was just litigated so poorly. You're right. It wasn't clear what the relief was. This seemed to be really about one or two things. One possibility, this is an attempt to delay the certification of the votes in states so that Trump could continue to search for a path to overturn the election. That is, there's nothing plausible yet, but maybe something will turn up. The other possibility is that this is an attempt to humor the boss. Dan Dresner has this book, Toddler in Chief, and this seems like maybe you're trying to please Trump by giving him what he wants. And he said he wants to litigate the hell out of this. And, already before the election said, we're bringing in the lawyers. And so they brought in the lawyers. They just brought in lawyers to file, I don't want to call them necessarily frivolous suits, but really small bore lawsuits that are not going to really make a difference in.
Patrick Basham has weighed in with his column for The Express. He runs the Democracy Institute. And we talked about his polling quite a bit over the past few weeks. He was on Joseph Cotto's show at least twice. Headline, Stalin said it's not important who votes, but how they are counted. Fast forward to this American election, and the late dictator's wry remark rings eerily true. If you count the ballot fraud, most pollsters clearly failed. If you don't include the fraudulent ballots, most pollsters failed on a spectacular scale. The accurate pollsters were also the most accurate in 2016, along with Richard Barris's meticulous state-level big data poll, Robert Cahaley's innovative Trafalgar Group swing state surveys. Our Democracy Institute Sunday Express polling pretty much nailed the 2020 election. Why were the other pollsters wrong? They relied upon surveys of registered voters that skew Democratic because a third of the respondents don't vote. We survey only likely voters who will actually cast a ballot. That's why we gave the Democrats a 2-point turnout advantage rather than the double-digit advantage often found in media polls. Most pollsters assumed a massive increase in turnout among pro-democratic, millennial, female, and minority voters, so they heavily weighted their results to reflect this flawed assumption. Turnout would be somewhat higher than 2016, but nothing like the scale of the pro-Biden electorate these other polls imagined. The actual somewhat higher turnout was evenly divided among new voters from both parties. How did pollsters miss 5 million new Trump voters? They refused to accept the shy Trump voter was real in 2016, so they didn't look for them in 2020. We knew they were real, and we found far more of them this year. This time, shy Trump voters were disproportionately black males in urban areas and suburban white women. This data confirmed the significant movement of black voters towards Trump and the movement of a segment of suburban white women back to Trump. As a result, we predicted his higher black vote to the actual percentage point. We also identified, due to Trump's pro-law and order stance, that he'd suffer only minor rather than seismic losses among suburban women. Other correct calls include Trump's precise national popular vote percentage and identifying the economy as the crucial issue. We forecast a large proportion of Hispanics voting for Trump, especially in Florida, Arizona, and Nevada. Jewish voters also chose Trump in higher than expected numbers, about 30%. We forecast this exactly. Ditto for Trump's spectacular evangelical vote. As well as correctly forecasting Trump's narrow margin with independents, we identified the exact high percentage of Republicans voting for Trump, which confirmed his base's devotion. We caught Florida within a few decimal points. We forecast Trump's healthy margins in Iowa and Ohio and his modest victories in North Carolina and Georgia. We projected his forthcoming wins in Arizona and Nevada. I wrote last Sunday that, should our Biden popular vote projection be off by a couple of points, it would reflect voter fraud rather than our having missed a Biden landslide. My words were prescient. Biden did poorly in Florida, Texas, and Ohio, lacking a get-out-the-vote campaign. Biden suffered lower student and minority turnout, and Biden marshaled the most apathetic supporters in memory. Trump's party held the Senate, gained numerous House seats, and didn't lose a state legislature. It therefore defies logic that Biden secured more votes than Barack Obama. If only valid votes are counted, Trump and Biden share the popular vote. Already there is a mountain of evidence, direct and circumstantial, of widespread ballot fraud. This evidence is buttressed by the divergence between the supposed tallies in these contested states, the actual tallies in comparable Midwestern states, and the demonstrably accurate polls referenced earlier. How curious that, as Rich Barris notes, Trump won the largest non-white vote share for a Republican presidential candidate in 60 years. Biden underperformed Hillary Clinton in every major metro area around the country, save for Milwaukee, Detroit, Atlanta, and Philadelphia. Robert Barnes, election analyst, observes in these big cities and swing states run by Democrats, the vote even exceeded the number of registered voters. Trump's victories in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin were on target until, in the middle of the night, counting was arbitrarily halted. Miraculously, several 100,000 votes, all for Biden, were mysteriously found. Trump's real lead subsequently vanished. The protracted eventual outcome will determine the contemporary relevance of Stalin's observation. No matter who wins, most pollsters already have lost their credibility and their influence. That's Patrick Basham.
In election outcomes.
And maybe that leads inevitably to the question that's been on my mind all week, which is, where is Bill Barr? You and I think within 24 hours of each other, wrote pieces this summer sounding the alarm about Bill Barr echoing this rhetoric about, mail-in ballots in foreign countries, stealing ballots and, tampering with the votes. And Bill Barr went to the mat on these claims about the inherent fraud of mailing in ballots. He has been silent, if I'm not mistaken, other than one little throat clearing this week about allowing folks into polling places. But does it signal something that listeners don't understand, that Barr has gone utterly, utterly silent as Trump rages about the things that Barr seemingly agreed with last summer?
I think it shows that there's a bottom even for Bill Barr, which is nice to see. We're not in full banana republic mode where you have the government making completely unsupported factual claims about an election being stolen. I was very concerned in seeing the report that DOJ had changed its rules so that it could send armed officers to seize ballots in the case of a potential election investigation. But none of that has materialized. The DOJ silence, I'm sure, is something that is really bothering the president. He's called on the Department of Justice to get involved. But if you're thinking about this as Bill Barr and you're imagining a post-Trump world, if you're trying to salvage any semblance of your credibility, you're not going to do something that's going to further undermine that credibility to no political end, because these things are not going to lead to a difference. Because at the end of the day, the norms that we have that have been so pressured seem to be holding at the moment that we need them to. I mean, we're recording this again Friday morning. We don't know exactly what things are going to look like, but I come in optimistic that we're going to make it through this moment.
And that raises the one big existential question I wanted to ask you, Rick, which is, you and I spent a lot of months worrying about institutions and systems not holding, and, the decentralized, rickety way that ballots are counted, and just the possibilities. I mean, I was thinking through all the conversations we had about what could go wrong. Polling place violence didn't happen. As you said, massive hack into the power grid in Detroit didn't happen. Deep fakes that change voter behavior didn't happen. Do you walk away from this election, assuming, as you say, it's over and maybe it's not, sanguine that the system worked, the system really worked? Or do you feel, holy cow, we clawed back catastrophe, but that doesn't mean the system works? In other words, maybe it's too soon to ask that question, but given how panicky both you and I were about whether institutions would hold, do you feel that maybe the framers got it more right than wrong here?
So I think that this election does not show that we are in a healthy democracy. It shows that we were able to survive because we got a little bit lucky. If the election had been just a little bit closer, I think the kinds of throwing this to the courts and potential violence and protests and counter-protests, and all of that really could have come to fruition. I mean, think of what Trump is building right now. He's getting some echoes from people like Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, is saying that the election was stolen. The Biden presidency is going to start out with a fairly significant portion of Trump's base believing that massive Democratic voter fraud stole this election from Donald Trump, a claim that is utterly belied by the evidence. So all of the pathologies that I described in Election Meltdown just seem to be still right there. And we got lucky. We didn't get smart. Now, election administrators worked really hard, and they made this election not be a failure in terms of enfranchisement. And despite the fact that Republicans, I think I counted in at least 17 different ways, I mean that literally, at least 70 different ways, tried to make it harder for people to vote in the middle of the pandemic, we still had record turnout. All of that is great. But if you go back to Election Meltdown and you look at the 4 reasons I say that Americans' trust in the legitimacy of elections is declining, you see that those are the same things that played out here. It was voter suppression, pockets of election administrator incompetence that are turned around and portrayed as fraud by members of the fraudulent fraud squad, dirty tricks in elections, including this harebrained scheme now where Wisconsin Republicans are trying to get Pennsylvania Republicans to send in late ballots illegally to try and show that the election was rife with fraud, and incendiary rhetoric about rigged or stolen elections. The 2 speeches that Trump gave this week where he claimed election fraud were among the lowest moments in American democracy. And so those 4 problems only got worse this time.
Okay, you're probably wondering, what does Mike Enoch
Media
think?
regulation they want to do.
What this reveals
Jack
to you
Dorsey
is
is really looking like Charlie Manson these days. What the fuck is happening there?
Well, he's just like moving further and further into like some weird cabin in Tibet or something like that. But I'll say this. This is the shot with Twitter.
Sure.
They want Holocaust denial to be officially, they got it with Facebook too. Remember, Facebook also actually didn't have a policy on Holocaust denial. And Zuckerberg even said that, which was sort of surprising. But it just took several months of pressure, and now Holocaust denial
This
is...
is and Republicans are going to get that done for you.
Well, I mean, it seems to be the only thing they give a fuck about.
We have no stronger ally in the Middle East than the state of Israel.
He's basically saying you'll flag the president for this, but you won't flag a Holocaust. How could you? They're the worst people on earth. We all agree.
You know, there is no room for white supremacy, and I condemn them as I have in the strongest terms possible. We need to make sure that we continue funding historically black colleges and universities, like I did mandatory funding just this past year.
Why is it that his line of questioning is
Really
geared at
hammering
more
on it.
censorship?
Because it's a Holocaust.
Right, no, but I mean, think about it. He doesn't say, why don't you just let people fucking speak freely on your platform, asshole?
The legislation before us today would simply reaffirm our strong support for Israel, including $3.3 billion per year in annual U.S. security assistance.
He's like, the problem we have is not that, like, the problem we have is your level, your suppression. He's asking for more suppression.
He wants you to suppress harder.
Yeah, you need to suppress more, Jack. What are you doing?
But we cannot allow speech, whether that's left or right, to be censored. And that's what you're starting to see. People who are put in the Twitter jail room because they have put forward an idea that somebody in San Francisco disagrees.
I think in reacting to this fucking senator from Denver or wherever, who's from fucking Colorado, it's like, hey, asshole.
Do you support a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented people, not just dreamers? Mr. Hickenlooper.
Yes, I do.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes, I believe we can get there, and we should.
Thank you.
Are they going to change the name of Colorado?
What?
It's not very well. I mean, it means colored.
I'm not prepared for that derail right now.
It's like, I mean, we got the Washington Redskins.
It means colored in what language?
I mean,
Spanish?
does it matter? It just means colored. We can't have maybe saying colored. Might as well name that state nigger.
Well, that would be great.
Whoa. Disavow.
Because as we know that the mail-in ballots really were more significant, or proven to be more significant. I want to talk about the alt-right, and I want to revisit the conversation we were having and see if we still agree or still even think what we thought a few nights ago. I said to you on election night that the alt-right has badly misread the last 4 years, and I attribute a lot of this to closeness to Trump. So somebody in the chat said Trump killed the alt-right. It wasn't Spencer and co. And not that I'm blaming Richard Spencer or anybody in particular, but let's just take the alt-right as an example. People who were very close to Trump came to prominence because of support of Trump. And because of that closeness, I wonder how badly it has skewed our ability to view the situation with clear eyes. Hatred and anger don't actually make for a good framework to look at the world. So I want to ask you, well, let me run through some of these points I had first. They're too close to Trump, spurned lover syndrome to get the pulse of America. And I also said to you that the fringe of the alt-right, like say NRX, neo-absolutists, Fuentes and Doolittle, just to name some people, criticized the alt-right for being so sociopathically hostile to America and conservatism and things like that. And I wonder, is that still true? Do we still think that? I mean, where do you land on that particular issue?
I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, the most important thing to ask you is, what does the fucking term alt-right even mean? I don't know. I actually would say that a lot of the people that I follow, and I'm not going to name any names here, and there's very few people that on the internet that I would actually respect or look to for political advice. Of course, you being one of them. A lot of them call the election for Biden.
Yeah.
They understood the way that this was moving, and they correctly assessed that the coalition that Trump put together in 2016 would either be dead or feel betrayed or be uninclined to go vote for Trump based on what he's done over the past 4 years. So I'm not entirely sure that those who were third positionists in 2016 actually lost the pulse of America. I'm not actually willing to say that. So I think that's a fair criticism to a certain extent. But I'm not willing to say that. A lot of people that I know that have smaller followings were more apt to predict what happened than people with bigger followings. And I'm 100% willing to die on that hill. So I think that those people were correct. They understood what was going on. Now, yeah, this is a different conversation. If Trump wins the election by landslide, we could sit back and say, well, what the fuck were all these people thinking? Trump, of course, was the representative of white America and civic nationalist America and so on. But I'm not willing to say that a lot of dissident thinkers were incorrect on this. Mm-hmm. John, that's pretty funny. of course, you would put that on the screen. I'm not willing to say that they got it wrong. I'm not. I think it took some bravery to be a right winger and pick against Trump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe we should turn our attention to some of the super chats that have come in. Unless there's anything that you really want to get off your chest at the moment.
Winner is Goldman Sachs, Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, health insurance CEOs, and out-of-control inequality and corruption. Whoopee! What now? Everything. The libs are going to go back to sleep at their long collective brunch, and I say good. We don't need them. They only get in the way anyway. America has elected the architect of the system that gave us the last 4 years. Expecting that architect to fix our problems is final proof that America is a failed state. Well, what happens next? It doesn't matter who's in the House or in the Senate. We, the people, must rise up. We must make demands. Americans need health care now. Americans need a stimulus check now. Americans need the wars to end now. They need a living wage now. Being in the streets isn't enough, unless that street is in front of the White House, City Hall, or a politician's home. Politicians stand for nothing unless we are standing on them. Except no more excuses from Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders. Movements have to move. Workers have the power. Workers make this nation run. Workers make the profits. Labor needs to exercise this power now. We need to stop talking about pushing the nation left. We're not pushing the nation left. We're pushing the nation back to the people. No matter what the political hacks try to convince you of, America has elected a bona fide racist into the presidency. Joe Biden has done more damage to the minorities with policy, more damage to minorities than all of Donald Trump's tweets combined. Democrats' marketing campaign has turned a demented puppet of the oligarchy, an enemy of working people, into Uncle Joe. Yeah, an uncle who would kick your family out of their home, steal your money, cut your Social Security, and give it to the banks and credit card predators while sending your children to war. We need an anti-war movement to rise up now. The next commander-in-chief is a warmonger. You could not find someone with more blood on their hands than Joe Biden. Biden has backed every war for the last 30 frickin' years. Democrats will sell you overseas wars under the banner of humanitarianism, under the banner of protecting the international order, under the banner of spreading democracy. Don't be fooled by the Democrats' concerned face for imperialism. All the techniques used for Russiagate are going to be deployed against this dissent from the left. Just know that. All the independent media that willingly went along with Russiagate and fed into the hysteria of Russiagate, they need to make a stand now. Do you stand against the corrupt power class, or do you serve the establishment narrative? We need an independent media that has guts. We need an independent media that will stand on principle. We need an independent media that pushes politicians instead of protecting them. Democrats are going to hide behind Kamala Harris. They're going to use her identity, her gender, her fake charm. The happy enforcer of Joe Biden's racist mass incarceration state, Kamala Harris was the VP choice for a reason. Ignore her. We must stand with all communities who will now be targeted by a friendlier, more competent, better-mannered, privatized incarceration state under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We can't wait. There's going to be a Republican wave in 2022. Republicans have the money and the networks to reconstruct itself from the ashes. Democrats will pretend to be the victims of process and pragmatism. Don't give in to the Democrats' gaslighting. I mean, the nation's in crisis. People are out of money. The economy's being sucked dry by billionaires. Millions of people are losing their health care, losing their jobs and their homes. And now we're going to have no Trump to distract us. Democrats are going to be forced to show which side are they on. We need Medicare for all. No public option. No public option. Public option was the compromise position 13 years ago. A public option will create an apartheid healthcare system where taxpayers will be paying for people who actually need healthcare while the subsidized insurance companies get more money than ever. Any politician trying to convince you that the public option is a good deal is your enemy and a sellout. No means-tested programs. That only divides us. We're in this together. I do better when you do better. We need a Green New Deal, and we need it now because the planet is facing climate collapse, and Joe Biden's plan targets 2050. Joe Biden's going to be dead before then, but under his plan, we'll all be dead before 2050. A massive Green New Deal infrastructure plan will boost our economy coming out of this pandemic, and it'll create jobs and create an economy for the future. It's going to save the planet, and it's going to save our children. But Joe Biden's more interested in short-term profits. His owners are more interested in short-term profits, which is why he is. Short-term.
Okay, let's go to a clip here from
He's a distinguished
Newsmax.
university law professor at Toro College. Sir, thank you for joining us. Give us your perspective on all of this right now.
Well, Rob, look, there's several different levels to this. There's some of the state cases that deal with things like defects in the balloting, right? Phantom voting, commingling of ballots. Not all of that involves fraud. We're spending too much time talking about fraud. For instance, this new allegation that in Nevada, if there were tranches of ballots that went unverified, that just got tossed into the pile and got tabulated without anyone verifying the technical requirements of the balloting, that does not serve democracy. So those are separate issues. Also, the president, of course, is entitled to recounts in several of the states in which the margins of victory were so small. But the one thing, Rob, that no one's really spending a lot of time talking about is the Supreme Court case. I've been talking about it since I first appeared on Newsmax the morning after the election. People are discounting the significance of it. The case is already at the Supreme Court, Rob. Just last night, or 2 nights ago, Justice Alito reminded Pennsylvania election officials, make sure the ballots are segregated. Why would a Supreme Court justice, for the second time already in 2 weeks, tell Pennsylvania to segregate the ballots of the late arriving ballots? Because the reason is accepting those ballots might ultimately be constitutionally impermissible. Justice Kavanaugh wrote that in the concurring opinion in Wisconsin 2 weeks ago, and Justices Gorsuch and Thomas, from what everyone believes, agrees with that. And of course, you have now Justice Barrett, President Trump's most latest addition to the Supreme Court. That's 5 justices. And if the extending the deadline was constitutionally impermissible in Pennsylvania, then theoretically it was impermissible in Nevada and in Georgia. And all of those states, if the Supreme Court chooses to do so, all of those late arriving ballots could be invalidated.
How many do you think does that make it? Does that get the president to a different number? Does that change it? Does that flip it?
You're raising a good point, Rob. The Supreme Court is definitely going to ask, as a matter of fact, how many ballots are we talking about? Because if there are too few, the court doesn't want to get into an academic exercise, right? They may say this was constitutionally impermissible, but it doesn't make a difference. But again, the Trump legal team keeps saying that there's tens of thousands of ballots that are in some ways suspect. And again, I'm not even using the word fraud. I'm just saying they're suspect, that they don't serve the interest of democracy because they weren't being verified. So if in fact what we don't know is how many ballots actually arrived after Election Day and that ultimately got tabulated and were segregated. And until we know the answer to that, and to know whether, remember, 70% of those ballots we expect had gone in the mail-in category, went to the Democrats, went to Joe Biden, right? So you have to do the math to figure out how many of the ballots that came in after Election Day could reasonably be counted by Biden and then would have to be subtracted from his total. But you're quite right, Rob. The court is going to have to show that there's evidence that the balloting actually would flip the outcome. And if it doesn't flip the outcome, the court's probably not interested in the constitutional question. If it is, all I'm saying is this Supreme Court has already sent a very strong message that it is very interested in what's happened in Pennsylvania in light of the fact
With what Alito did, yeah.
Right. And Justice Kavanaugh in the Wisconsin case, they're very, very clearly interested in saying the Constitution says that state laws regarding federal elections must be enacted by legislators, not courts, not election officials, legislators. And not in Georgia, not in North Carolina, not in Pennsylvania, not in Nevada, were any of the legislators responsible for passing legislation to extend the deadline. And this is what Kavanaugh is interested in, and certainly Alito. Remember, Alito warned everyone. Unless we decide this 2 weeks ago. And he didn't. We probably wish we had, because he wondered why are we not dealing with this now to give voters at least the assurance that their vote will be counted.
That's so interesting. Boy, that really did. You bring some great perspective here, because when you think about it like that, if it's not just Pennsylvania, if you're then extending it out to Georgia and other states, then you start to see a possibility where something could flip. Because I keep looking at this thinking that if it's just one state, the president's down in like 5 states right now. He's got to win 4 of them. You know, it's got to be more universal.
Right, and Rob, one more point. Everyone, including Rudy Giuliani, is talking about fraud, right? Everyone is using about abuse. And what you and I are just talking about with Mark has nothing to do with fraud, abuse. It's not a matter of facts. It's a matter of constitutional law, right? Yeah. Was it impermissible to count any of those ballots? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know several Supreme Court justices are interested in the question. It has been under review in Pennsylvania, and one Supreme Court justice just told Pennsylvania a day ago, make sure to keep the ballots segregated. He must have a reason for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thane Rosenbaum, great to have you. Appreciate it.
Okay, let's go back to this Slate podcast with UCI law professor Rick Hasen.
We dodged a bullet. We're in deep trouble. And with a Democratic president and a Republican Senate, I don't see that we're going to get the kind of fundamental election reform that we need to avoid these problems. And so we're going to be doing this podcast again in early 2024. Hopefully by then I won't have to wear a mask when I see you, but I am not at all confident that we are somehow out of the woods when it comes to running our elections in a way that people will accept as legitimate.
This episode of Amicus is brought to you by UNICEF USA, one that offers since 2015 you to step confidently into the world. MSNBC cutting away, the speeches are nuts, everybody laughing into their sleeves. And I think we toggle back and forth, even in the media, between those two realities, that he is all powerful and that he is absurd. But I think you're saying something really important, and I just feel that it's worth emphasizing. Those two speeches he's given, the statement that the White House put out on Friday morning about stolen elections, about how this entire thing is a sham, that's profoundly dangerous. It's easy to say it's also Saturday Night Live for tonight, but it's also deeply destabilizing for a lot of people, millions of people who take him at his word. And so I think there's a way in which some of the giddiness of watching this King Lear performance elides this much more, I think, in some way, terrifying problem of what it is that he is going to do on the way out.
Well, there's the what does he do between now and January 20th, which is concerning because he still has the power of the presidency. He still has a lot of levers that he could use. But I'm even more worried about the post-presidency because, whether he sets up his perch at Trump TV or he announces that he's running for president in 2024 and starts his rallies back up and his super spreading events and all of that, he's going to be someone who is just going to...
Okay, so Trump super spreading events, all these Biden celebrations, tens of thousands of people packed together, are those super spreader events? Black Lives Matter rallies, are those super spreader events? Antifa rallies, are those super spreader events? Or are they only super spreader events when Republicans do them?
Continue to egg on millions of followers who believe whatever he says, even when it is completely unsupported by the evidence, even when Fox News comes out and says the president has not put forward evidence to support his claims. And so, yeah, I mean, we can celebrate that it appears, going to have a relatively peaceful transition of power, but that doesn't mean that we're out of the woods in the short to medium term in terms of the American civil life and what it means to be a gracious loser. What defines a democracy is that you hold a free and fair election, and that the losers, although quite disappointed, accept the election results as legitimate and agree to fight another day under the rules that we have. The best case scenario is that Trump leaves office grumbling about voter fraud, and we don't hear a lot more about it. But I don't think that's the way things are going to go.
Rick, I want to ask you one last slightly wonky question that I think belongs at the center of this conversation, which is, you've already said it's unlikely we're going to see serious bipartisan election reform, the kinds of things you've been advocating for as long as I've known you, going into the next couple of years. But I think there's another problem, which is we're going to see redistricting. We're going to see this census being deployed. We're going to see more gerrymandering. In other words, I don't think this is a net neutral coming out of this election. I think we are going to see, in some sense, a lot of structural changes that are going to mean even less democracy next time you and I do this show in 4 years. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Because I think, as I said, it's not getting enough attention this week.
I mentioned earlier this lawsuit that Trump brought about the postal ballots that are coming in late in Pennsylvania. And although I don't think that's going to end up leading to anything here, what the pre-election fights over that case and related cases revealed is a Supreme Court that is curious about the idea that only state legislatures have the power to set election rules, and that state courts and state agencies don't have the power to do so. This could set up a scenario where the Supreme Court reverses a 2015 case, the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission versus Arizona Legislature. And in that case, on a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court said essentially that you can have redistricting reform done by voter initiative without violating the rights of state legislatures to set the rules for elections. It was a 5-4 decision. It was the 4 liberals on the court then, with Justice Kennedy, Chief Justice Roberts.
And looking at Twitter, Jim Hoff, Gateway Pundit, reports that Jeanine Pirro's show was canceled tonight on Fox News after they found out she was going to report on election fraud. That's interesting. All right, let's.
We understand, apparently this is just coming to me as news as well, that her show has been suspended tonight and did not air over at Fox News Channel. Sources close to the network telling us that's because she made a very staunch defense of President Trump and wanted to expose, or attempt to expose, the voter fraud that the Republicans and the president, I should say, are claiming took place in the election. Fox decided not to air Judge Jeanine Pirro's show because that was going to be the content of the program. It's a Saturday night show.
Wrote a really impassioned dissent. If we're outside the realm of deciding a presidential election and these issues come back, it's quite possible that we're going to see the Supreme Court say that in federal elections, voters can't pass initiatives to make voting reforms, that state courts can't rely on state constitutions to protect voting rights. These would be profoundly terrible changes, and it would make the Supreme Court really the biggest impediment to election reform. Forget the fact that Mitch McConnell is not going to pass a Biden bill to establish election standards across the country or something like that. You can imagine a situation where, for example, the North Carolina General Assembly, their legislature, passes a gerrymandering plan. There are a bunch of Republicans there, and they've been engaged in some very tough gerrymanders in the past. And let's say the state Supreme Court, which is Democratic dominated, strikes it down as violating the state constitution.
Michael Tracy tweets, journalists are tweeting about all the support they will need to work through the trauma of the Trump years. If you were so traumatized, maybe you should have done something else. Find a different life pursuit that can accommodate emotionally crippled basket cases.
The U.S. Supreme Court could come in that case and say, you know what? State Supreme Court can't do that. State legislature is supreme, gerrymandering back on the boards. Or you think about all the election reforms in the Western states, especially that have been passed by voters through voter initiatives, establishing redistricting commissions, establishing open primaries, requiring that there be automatic voter registration, all kinds of things passed by initiative. All of those are potentially under threat over the next few years if the Supreme Court comes in and adopts this very muscular, independent state legislature doctrine. So I'm worried about the courts on that sense. I'm worried about the courts also in terms of allowing more voter suppression and eviscerating the remaining parts of the Voting Rights Act. With a 6-3 Supreme Court, and now, 2 weeks ago, the conversation was about court packing. Now the conversation is about whether Justice Thomas or Alito will retire during the lame duck so that there could be a 40-year-old Trumpy judge put on the Supreme Court. Things can go very bad on a 6-3 Supreme Court when it comes to voting rights. There's a voting rights case out of Arizona the Supreme Court's going to hear later this term. And the case we talked about on one of the earlier episodes of Election Meltdown involving Kansas, the Fish versus Kobach case. This was the case about show me your papers before you can register to vote, show me a birth certificate or naturalization certificate. That case, the cert petition has been filed. That case is going up to the Supreme Court, and they're going to decide probably early 2021 whether or not they're going to hear that case. I'm really worried about what's going to happen with voting rights and election reform over the next few years. Have I cheered you up yet?
Everybody is going to get into their beds and put their pillows over their heads. I want to end on one happy note. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, and I think that Donald Trump's judiciary didn't have a chance in this election to really flex its muscle, but it's going to, and I think we forget that at our peril. I want to end with one slightly optimistic note, which is in some sense, despite everything, people voted. People voted despite COVID. They organized. People knocked on doors. Stacey Abrams changes the shape of the race in Georgia. I wonder if part of the problem on this show is that we talk about systems, we talk about courts, we talk about what's going to happen in the House, what's going to happen in the Senate. But despite everything, despite the rug of despair that has rolled us all the way from our election meltdown finale till today, somehow people voted and overmastered all of it. And I wonder if maybe you could suggest for folks who were counting on court reform, who were counting on massive HR 1 style voting reforms, what's the work? What's the work for people who've been organized and activated and want to claw back for democracy in the coming years?
A lot of that work is going to be on the state and local level. And we see, and Georgia is a great example, that grassroots organizing and political activism can make a difference. Voter turnout was way up. In some places that benefited Biden, in some places that benefited Trump. But for our democracy, the more people who are voting and who are participating, the better we're going to be. Getting state legislatures to make changes like automatic voter registration, which turned out to be so important in Georgia. Georgia's a Republican state, and they made it easier for people to register to vote. They've done other things that are terrible. We've talked about it on the show, but they did make it easier for people to register to vote. I mean, there are lots of things that can be done. I just posted on my blog the fact that according to a study by the Civics Center, there will be 23,000 more young people who will be able to vote in the Georgia runoffs than there were for the election in November. That is, there are 23,000 more Georgians who will be 18 by the time we get to the next election, these runoffs that will happen. And those people can be mobilized, and those people will become registered because of Georgia's system. So these things can make a difference.
Rick Hasen teaches election law at UC Irvine.
Okay, Rick Hasen there at UC Irvine. This is Pastor.
The election is not over with yet. Now, there are a whole lot of things that are going on. in terms of who's going to win and the mail boats coming in. But I want to tell you that what we see happening is not the righteous fighting the wicked, when we see Biden and Camelback ain't Black Harris or Tribulation Trump fighting one another or trying to win this election. And I'm not sure what side you're on or who you're for. Quite frankly, both of these people are as wicked as they do, and you are wrong if you support either one of them. And you need to be clear about that. And you may say, well, I'd rather see this one or that one. You know, had an interview with for crying out loud, I never thought I'd have an interview with a newspaper from Iceland. You ever know what Iceland is? Iceland. Are you serious? and so the guy asked me in the interview, who was I for? And I said, neither. He said, well, what about the lesser of the two evils? There is no such thing as a lesser of two evils. The evil is evil. There is no thing as a lesser of two evils. Not, you know, the Catholic in terms of cardinal sins and venal sins. But there is no, if evil is evil, so there is no, and I had to straighten them out on that. Well, don't you think that you should take one of the, no. Now, I'll express some things about where I see it going, but I can tell you what you see happening now with the son of Satan versus the servant of Satan. The son of Satan being the long-legged Mac Daddy Obama, and the servant of Satan, they are fighting for their father's approval. There is an interesting event in 1 Kings, I think it is, where Solomon dies, and Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon, legitimately, and Jeroboam, who is an enemy of Solomon, split up the kingdom. And God actually splits it up. God does it. God gives 10 kingdoms to Jeroboam and 2 to Rehoboam. And they were at war with one another continually until such developed as Samaria. And what we see the fighting we see between Biden and Trump, or the son of Satan, who is Obama, and then his son, who is the grandson of Satan. Now we're going to call Biden the grandson of Satan. And Camelback ain't Black Harris, the granddaughter of Satan. And to make that work for you, in case you're not willing to go there, to make it work, you know, Biden was the vice. He was the heir apparent to the throne of the son of Satan, Obama, except Hillary Jezebel Clinton stepped in and said she wanted it. Let's roll things back. If Biden had ran against Tribulation Trump in 2016, he would have most likely won. But Jezebel stepped in and said she wanted it, and Obama had to back off, and Biden had to step back and wait his turn. Now, Obama, the son of Satan, worked as feverishly as he possibly could, along with the Democrat Party, to make sure that Jezebel Clinton didn't win. They thought they could put up with 4 years of Trump. They thought that he's a nobody, he's a playboy, the guys, they thought he was a buffoon. They thought they could put up with him for 4 years, and then they put Biden in as the son of Satan. You remember it was Biden who suggested that Obama move forward with LGBTQ and the world would accept it. But it had to take a 4-year interlude. And in the 4-year interlude steps Trump. They had no idea that he was going to do or be who he was. They thought they could run over him. They thought that he would just be a pushover, that he really didn't know anything. He wasn't politically savvy. They thought they could jerk his chain. But what they were not aware of is that Satan was in the mix as well.
This is a bit of a news blog we do, looking at spiritual wickedness in high places for the most part.
Okay, that's Pastor Manning. I think I'm going to call it a night. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.